Chapter 24 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, a story of the Red Sand Valley by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 24 In the Dead of Night. It was sundown in the Red Sand Valley. The hush of evening had settled upon Malkern, and its calm was only broken by the droning machinery of the mills. The sky was lit by that chilly yellow afterglow of sunset which, eastward, merges into the gray and purple of twilight. Already the long-drawn shadows had expanded into the dusk so rapidly obscuring the remoter distance. Straight and solemn rose spires of smoke from hidden chimneys, lolling in the still air, as though loath to leave the scented atmosphere of the valley below. It was the moment of delicious calm when nature is preparing to seek repose. Two women were standing at the door of Dave's house, and the patch of garden surrounding them, so simple, so plain, was a perfect setting for their elderly, plainly clad figures. Dave's mother, very old but full of quiet energy, was listening to the gentle complaint of Mrs. Chepstow. She was listening, but her gaze was fixed on the distant mills, an attitude which had practically become her settled habit. The mill, to her, was the end of the earth. There was nothing beyond. "I am dreadfully worried," Mrs. Tom was saying, the anxious wrinkles of her forehead lifting her brows perplexedly. "It's more than 6 weeks since I heard from Tom and Betty. It's not like him. He's so regular with letters, usually. It was madness letting Betty go up there. I can't think what we were doing. If anything has happened to them, I shall never forgive myself. I think I shall go down and talk to Dave about it. He may know something. He's sure to know if they are well." The other slowly withdrew her gaze from the mills. It was as though the effort required to do so were a great one, and one she reluctantly undertook. The pivot of her life was her boy, a pivot upon which it revolved without flagging or interruption. She had watched him grow to a magnificent manhood, and with all a pure woman's love and wonderful instinct she had watched and tended him as she might some great oak tree raised from the frailest sapling. Then, when his struggles came, she had shared them with him with a supreme loyalty, helping him with a quiet, strong sympathy which found expression in little touches which probably even he never realized. All his successes and disasters had been hers, all his joys, all his sorrows. And now, in her old age, she clung to this love with a pathetic tenacity of one who realizes that the final parting is not far distant. Her furrowed face lit with a wonderful smile. "I cannot say for sure," she said. "There are times when Dave will not admit me to the thoughts which disturb him. At such times I know that things are not running smoothly. There are other times when he talks quite freely of his hopes, his fears. Then I know that all is well. When he complains I know he is questioning his own judgment, and distrusts himself. And when he laughs at things I know that the trouble is a sore one, and I prepare for disaster. All his moods have meaning for me. Just now I am reading from his silence, and it tells me that much is wrong, and I am wondering. But I do not think it concerns Betty, and, consequently, not your husband. If anything were wrong with her, I think I should know." She smiled with all the wisdom of old age. Mrs. Tom's anxiety was slightly allayed, but her curiosity was proportionately roused. "Why would you know about Betty?" she asked. The older woman's eyes were again turned in the direction of the mill. "Why? Why?" She smiled and turned to the churchman's wife. "It would produce a fresh mood in my boy, one I'm not familiar with." Then she became suddenly grave. I think I should dread that mood more than any other. You see, deep down in his heart there are passionate depths that no one has yet stirred. Were they let loose, I fear to think how they might drive him. Dave's head only rules just as far as his heart chooses." "But Betty?" demanded Mrs. Tom. "How is she—" "Betty?" interrupted the other, humorously eyeing the eager face. "The one great passion of Dave's life is Betty. I know. And he thinks it is hopeless. I am betraying no confidence. Dave hugs his secret to himself, but he can't hide it from me. I'm glad he loves her. You don't know how glad. You see, I am in love with her myself, and I am getting very old." "And does Betty know?" Dave's mother shook her head and smiled. "Betty loves him, but neither understands the other's feelings. But that is nothing. Love belongs to heaven, and heaven will straighten this out. Listen." The old woman's eyes turned abruptly in the direction of the mill. There was a curious, anxious look in them, and a perplexed frown drew her brows together. One hand was raised to hold the other woman's attention. It was as though something vital had shocked her, as though some sudden spasm of physical pain had seized her. Her face slowly grew gray. 3 people passing along the trail in front of the house had also stopped. Their eyes were also turned in the direction of the mill. Further along, a child at play had suddenly paused in its game to turn toward the mill. There were others, too, all over the village who gave up their pursuits to listen. "The mills have stopped work," cried Mrs. Tom, breathlessly. But Dave's mother had no response for her. She had even forgotten the other's presence at her side. The drone of the machinery was silent. Dawson was interviewing his employer in the latter's office. Both men looked desperately worried. Dave's eyes were lit with a brooding light. It was as though a cloud of storm had settled upon his rugged features. Dawson had desperation in every line of his hard face. "Have you sent up the river?" demanded Dave, eyeing his head man as though he alone were responsible for the trouble which was upon them. "I've sent, boss. We've had jams on the river before, and I guessed it was that. I didn't worry any for 24 hours. It's different now. There ain't been a log come down for nigh 36 hours. "How many men did you send up?" "6. 2 teams, and all the gear needed for breaking the jam." "Yes. You're sure it is a jam?" "There ain't nothin' else, boss. Leastways, I can't see nothin' else." "No. And the boom? You've worked out the reserve?" "Clean right out. There ain't a log in it fit to cut." Dave sat down at his desk. He idled clumsily for some moments with the pen in his fingers. His eyes were staring blankly out of the grimy window. The din of the saws rose and fell, and the music for once struck bitterly into his soul. It jarred his nerves, and he stirred restlessly. What was this new trouble that had come upon him? No logs! No logs! Why? He could not understand. A jam? Dawson said it must be a jam on the river. He was a practical lumberman, and to him it was the only explanation. He had sent up men to find out and free it. But why should there be a jam? The river was wide and swift, and the logs were never sent down in such crowds as to make a thing of that nature possible at this time of year. Later, yes, when the water was low and the stream slack, but now, after the recent rains, it was still a torrent. No logs. The thought was always his nightmare, and now it was a reality. "It must be a jam, I suppose," said Dave presently, but his tone carried no conviction. "What else can it be, boss? asked the foreman anxiously. His employer's manner, his tone of uncertainty, worried Dawson. He had never seen Dave like this before. "That's so." Then a look of eager interest came into his eyes. He pointed at the window. "Here's Odd," he said, "and he's in a hurry." Dawson threw open the door, and Simon Odd lumbered hurriedly into the room. He seemed to fill up the place with his vast proportions. His face was anxious and doubtful. "I've had to shut down at the other mill, boss," he explained abruptly. "There ain't no logs. There've been none for—" "36 hours," broke in Dave, with an impatient nod. "I know." "You know, boss?" "Yes." The master of the mills turned again to the window, and the two men watched him in silence. What would he do? This man to whom they looked in difficulty, this man who had never yet failed in resource, in courage, to meet and overcome every obstacle, every emergency that harassed a lumberman's life. Suddenly he turned to them again. In his eyes there was a peculiar, angry light. "Well?" he demanded, in a fierce way that was utterly foreign to him. "Well?" he reiterated. "What are you standing there for? Get you out, both of you. Shut this mill down, too." Simon Odd moved to the door, but Dawson remained where he was. It almost seemed as if he had not understood. The mill was to be shut down for the first time within his knowledge. What did it mean? In all his years of association with Dave he had seen such wonders of lumbering done by him that he looked upon him as almost infallible. And now he was tacitly acknowledging defeat without making a single effort. The realization, the shock of it, held him still. He made no move to obey the roughly spoken command. Suddenly Dave turned on him. His face was flushed. "Get out!" he roared. "Shut down the mill!" It was the cry of a man driven to a momentary frenzy. For the time despair, black, terrible despair, drove the lumberman. He felt he wanted to hit out and hurt someone. Dawson silently followed Odd to the door, and in 5 minutes the saws were still. Dave sat on at his desk waiting. The moment the shriek of the machinery ceased, he sprang to his feet and began pacing the floor in nervous, hurried strides. What that cessation meant to him only those may know who have suddenly seen their life's ambitions, their hopes, crushed out at one single blow. Let the saws continue their song, let the droning machinery but keep its dead level of tone, and failure in any other form, however disastrous, could not hurt in such degree as the sudden silencing of his lumberman's world. For some minutes he was like a madman. He could not think. His nerves shivered from his feet to the crown of his great ugly head. His hands were clenched as he strode, until the nails of his fingers cut the flesh of the palms into which they were crushed. For some minutes he saw nothing but the black ruin that rose like a wall before him and shut out every thought from his mind. The cessation of machinery was like a pall suddenly burying his whole strength and manhood beneath its paralyzing weight. But gradually the awful tension eased. It could not hold and its victim remain sane. So narrow was his focus during those first passionate moments that he could not see beyond his own personal loss. But with the passing minutes his view widened, and into the picture grew those things which had always been the inspiration of his ambitions. He flung himself heavily into his chair, and his eyes stared through the dirty window at the silent mill beyond. And for an hour he sat thus, thinking. His nervous tension had passed, his mind became clear, and though the nature of his thoughts lashed his heart, and 100 times drove him to the verge of that first passion of despair again, There was an impersonal note in them which allowed the use of his usually clear reasoning, and so helped him to rise above himself once more. His castles had been set a-tumbling, and he saw in their fall the crushing of Malkern, the village which was almost as a child to him. And with the crushing of the village must come disaster to all his friends. For one weak moment he felt that this responsibility should not be his. It was not fair to fix it on him. What had he done to deserve so hard a treatment? He thought of Tom Chepstow, loyal, kindly, always caring and thinking for those who needed his help. He thought of the traders of the village who hoped and prayed for his success, that meant prosperity for themselves and happiness for their wives and children. And these things began to rekindle the fighting flame within him, the flame which hitherto had always burned so fiercely. He could not let them go under. Then with a rush a picture rose before his mind, flooding it, shutting out all those others, every thought of self or anybody else. It was Betty, with her gentle face, her soft brown hair and tender smiling eyes. Their steady, courageous light shone deep down into his heart, and seemed to smite him for his weakness. His pulses began to throb. The weakened tide of his blood was sent coursing through his veins and mounted steadily to his brain. God! He must not go under. Even now the loyal child was up in the hills fighting his battles for him with— He broke off and sprang to his feet. A terrible fear had suddenly leapt at his heart and clutched him. Betty was up there in the hills. He had not heard from the hill camps for weeks, and now the supply of logs had ceased. What had happened? What was happening up there? The lethargy of despair lifted like a cloud. He was alert, thrilling with all the virility of his manhood set pulsing through his veins. Once more he was the man Dawson had failed to recognize when he ordered the mills to be closed down. Once more he was the man whose personal force had lifted him to his position as the master of Malkern's mills. He was the Dave whom all the people of the village knew, ready to fight to the last ounce of his power, to the last drop of his blood. "They shan't beat us," he muttered as he strode out into the yard. Nor could he have said of whom he was speaking, if anybody at all. It was nearly midnight. Again Dawson and Simon Odd were in their employer's office. But this time a very different note prevailed. Dawson's hard face was full of keen interest. His eyes were eager. He was listening to the great man he had always known. Simon Odd, burly and unassuming, was waiting his turn when his chief had finished with his principal foreman. "I've thought this thing out, Dawson," Dave said pleasantly, in a tone calculated to inspire the other with confidence, and in a manner suggesting that the affair of the logs had not seriously alarmed him, "and evolved a fresh plan of action. No doubt, as you say, the thing's simply a jam on the river. If this is so, it will be freed in a short time, and we can go ahead. On the other hand, there may be some other reason for the trouble. I can't think of any explanation myself, but that is neither here nor there. Now I intend going up the river tonight. Maybe I shall go on to the camps. I shall be entirely guided by circumstances. Anyway, I shall likely be away some days. Whatever is wrong, I intend to see it straight. In the meantime you will stand ready to begin work the moment the logs come down. And when they come down, I intend they shall come down at a pace that shall make up for all the time we have lost. That's all I have for you. I simply say, be ready. Good night." The man went out with a grin of satisfaction on his weather-beaten face. This was the Dave he knew, and he was glad. Simon Odd received his orders. He too must be ready. He must have his men ready. His mill must be asked to do more than ever before when the time came, and on his results would depend a comfortable bonus the size of which quite dazzled the simple giant. With his departure Dave began his own preparations. There was much to see to in leaving everything straight for his foreman. Dawson was more than willing. This new responsibility appealed to him as no other confidence his employer could have reposed in him. They spent some time together, and finally Dave returned to his office. During the evening, inquirers from the village flooded the place. But no official information on the subject of the cessation of work was forthcoming, nor would Dave see any of them. They were driven to be content with gleanings of news from the mill hands, and these, with the simple lumberman's understanding of such things, explained that there was a jam on the river which might take a day, or even 2 days, to free. In this way a panic in the village was averted. Dave required provisions from home, but he could not spare the time to return there for them. He intended to set out on his journey at midnight. Besides, he had no wish to alarm his old mother, and somehow he was afraid she would drag the whole truth of his fears out of him. So he sent a note by one of the men setting out his requirements. His answer came promptly. The man returned with the kit bag only, and word that his mother was bringing the food down herself, and he smiled at the futility of his attempt to put her off. 10 minutes later she entered his office with her burden of provisions. Her face was calmly smiling. There was no trace of anxiety in it. So carefully was the latter suppressed that the effort it entailed became apparent to the man. "You shouldn't have bothered, Ma," he protested. "I sent the man up specially to bring those things down." His mother's eyes had a shrewd look in them. "I know," she said. "There's a ham and some bacon, biscuit, and a fresh roast of beef here. Then I've put in a good supply of groceries. Thanks, dear," he said gently. "You always take care of my inner man, but I wish you hadn't bothered this way." "It's no sort of trouble," she said, raising her eyes to his. Then she let them drop again. "Food don't need a lumberman's rough handling." The smile on Dave's face was good to see. He nodded. "I'd better tell you," he said. "You know we've stopped." His eyes lingered fondly on the aged figure. This woman was very precious to him. "Yes, I know." There was the very slightest flash of anxiety in the old eyes. Then it was gone. "I'm going up the river to find things out." "That's what I understood. Betty is up there, too." The quiet assurance of his mother's remark brought a fresh light into the man's eyes, and the blood surged to his cheeks. "Yes, Ma, that's it, chiefly." "I thought so. And I'm glad. You'll bring her back with you?" "Yes, Ma." "Good-bye, boy." His simple assurance satisfied her. Her faith in him was the faith of a mother. The man bent down and kissed the withered, upturned face. She went out, and Dave turned to the things she had brought him. She had thought of everything. And the food, he smiled. She was his mother, and the food had the amplitude such as is characteristic of a mother when providing for a beloved son. He must visit the barn to see about his horses. He went to the door. Opening it, he paused. Standing there, he became aware of the sound of approaching wheels. The absence of any noise from the mills had made the night intensely silent, so that the rattle of wheels upon the hard sand trail, though distant, sounded acutely on the night air. He stood listening, with one great hand grasping the door casing. Yes, they were wheels. And now, too, he could hear the sharp pattering of horses' hoofs. The sound was uneven, yet regular, and he recognized the gait. They were approaching at a gallop. Nearer they came, and of a sudden he understood they were practically racing for the mill. He left the doorway and moved out into the yard. He thought it might be the team which Dawson had sent out returning, and perhaps bringing good news of the jam on the river. He walked toward the yard gates and stood listening intently. The night was dark, but clear and still, and as he listened he fancied in the rattle of the vehicle he recognized the peculiar creak of a buckboard. Nearer and nearer it came, louder and louder the clatter of hoofs and the rattle of wheels. The gallop seemed labored, like the clumsy gait of weary horses, and the waiting man straining could plainly hear a voice urging them on. Suddenly he thought of the gates and promptly opened them. He hardly knew why he did so. It must have been the effect of the pace at which the horses were being driven. It must have been that the speed inspired him with an idea of emergency. Now he stood out in the road, and stooping, glanced along it till the faint light of the horizon revealed a dark object on the trail. He drew back and slowly returned to the office. The man's voice urging his horses on required no effort to hear now. It was hoarse with shouting, and the slashing of his whip told the waiting man of the pace at which he had traveled. The vehicle entered the yard gates. The urging voice became silent. The weary horses clattered up to the office door and came to a standstill. From the doorway Dave surveyed the outfit. He did not recognize it, but something about the man climbing out of the vehicle was familiar. "That you, Mason?" he asked sharply. "Yes, and another. Will you bear a hand to get him out?" Dave went to his assistance, wondering. Mason was busy undoing some ropes. Dave's wonder increased. As he came up he saw that the ropes held a man captive in the carryall. "Who is it?" he inquired. "Jim Truscott, whoever he may be," responded Mason with a laugh as he freed the last rope. "Ah, well, come right in, and bring him along, too." But Mason remembered the animals that had served him so well. "What about the plugs?" He was holding his captive, who stood silent at his side. "You go inside. I'll see to them." Dave watched Mason conduct his prisoner into the office, then he sprang into the buckboard and drove it across to the barn. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 25 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 25. Mason's Prisoner. In a few minutes Dave returned from the barn. He had chosen to attend to the horses himself, for his own reasons preferring not to rouse the man who looked after his horses. His thoughts were busy while he was thus occupied. As yet he had no idea of what actually occurred in the camps, but Mason's presence at such a time, the identity of his prisoner, the horse's condition of exhaustion, these things warned him of the gravity of the situation, and something of the possibilities. By the time he re-entered the office, he was prepared for anything his camp boss might have to tell him. He noted the faces of the two men carefully. In Mason he saw the weariness of a long nervous strain. His broad face was drawn, his eyes were sunken and deeply shadowed. From head to foot he was powdered with the red dust of the trail. Dave was accustomed to being well served, but he felt that this man had been serving him to something very near the limits of his endurance. Jim Truscott's face afforded him the keenest interest. It was healthier looking than he had seen it since his first return to Malkern. The bloated puffiness, the hallmark of his persistent debauches, had almost entirely gone. The health produced by open air and spare feeding showed in the tan of his skin. His eyes were clear, and though he, too, looked worn out, there was less of exhaustion about him than his captor. On the other hand, there was none of Mason's fearless honesty in his expression. There was a truculent defiance in his eyes, a furious scowl in the drawn brows. There was a nervousness in the loose, weak mouth. His wrists were lashed securely together by a rope which had been applied with scant mercy. Dave's eyes took all these things in, and he pointed to the latter as he addressed himself to his overseer. "Better loose that," he said, in that even voice which gave away so little of his real feelings. "Guess you're both pretty near done in," he went on, as Mason unfastened the knots. "Got down here in a hurry?" "Yes. Got any whiskey?" Mason had finished removing the prisoner's bonds when he spoke. "Brandy." "That'll do." The overseer laughed, as men will laugh when they are least inclined to. Dave poured out long drinks, and handed them to the two men. Mason drank his down at a gulp, but Truscott pushed his aside without a word. "There's a deal to tell," said the overseer as he set his glass down. "There's some hours to daylight," Dave replied. "Go right ahead, and take your own time." The other let his tired eyes rest on his prisoner for some moments, and remained silent. He was considering how best to tell his story. Suddenly he looked up. "The camp's on strike," he said. "Ah!" And it was Dave's eyes that fell upon Jim Truscott now. There was a world of significance in that ejaculation and the expression that leaped into the lumberman's eyes. It was a desperate blow the overseer had dealt him, but it was a blow that did not crush. It carried with it a complete explanation, and that explanation was of something he understood and had power to deal with. "And this?" Dave nodded in Jim's direction. "Is one of the leaders." "Ah!" Again came Dave's meaning ejaculation. Then he settled himself in his chair and prepared to listen. "Get going," he said, but he felt that he required little more explanation. Mason began his story by inquiries about his own letters to his employer, and learned that none of them had been received during the last few weeks, and he gave a similar reply to Dave's inquiries as to the fate of his letters to the camp. Then he went on to the particulars of the strike movement, from the first appearance of unrest to the final moment when it became an accomplished fact. He told him how the chance hands he had been forced to take on had been the disturbing element, and these, he was now convinced, had for some reason been inspired. He told of that visit on the Sunday night to the sutler's store. He told of his narrow escape, and of his shooting down one of the men, and the fortunate capture, made with the timely assistance of Tom Chepstow, of his prisoner. Dave listened attentively, but his eyes were always on Truscott, and at the finish of the long story his commendation was less hearty than one might have expected. "You've made good, Mason, and I'm obliged," he said, after a prolonged silence. "Say," he went on, glancing at his watch, "there's just 4½ hours to the time we start back for the camp. Go over to Dawson's shack and get a shakedown. Get what sleep you can. I'll call you in time. Meanwhile, I'll see to this fellow," he added, indicating the prisoner. "We'll have a heap of time for talk on the way to the camps." The overseer's eyes lit. "Are you going up to the camps?" he inquired eagerly. "Yes, surely. We'll have to straighten this out." Then a sudden thought flashed through his mind. "There's the parson and—" Mason nodded. "Yes, they've got my shack. There's plenty of arms and ammunition. I left parson to hurry back to—" "He wasn't with her when you left?" There was a sudden fierce light in Dave's eyes. Mason shook his head, and something of the other's apprehension was in his voice as he replied, "He was going back there." Dave's eyes were fiercely riveted upon Truscott's face. "We'll start earlier. Get an hour's sleep." There was no misunderstanding his employer's tone. In fact, for the first time since he had left the camp, Mason realized the full danger of those two he had left behind him. But he knew he had done the only possible thing in the circumstances, and besides, his presence there would have added to their danger. Still, as he left the office to seek the brief rest for which he was longing, he was not without a qualm of conscience which his honest judgment told him he was not entitled to. Dave closed the door carefully behind him. Then he came back to his chair, and for some moments surveyed his prisoner in silence. Truscott stirred uneasily under the cold regard. Then he looked up, and all his bitter hatred for his one-time friend shone in the defiant stare he gave him. "I've tried to understand, but I can't," Dave said at last, as though his words were the result of long speculation. "It is so far beyond me that— This is your doing, all your doing. It's nothing to do with those scabs. You and you alone have brought about this strike. First you pay a man to wreck my mills. You even try to kill me. Now you do this. You have thought it all out with devilish cunning. There is nothing that could ruin me so surely as this strike. You mean to wreck me, nor do you care who goes down in the crash. You have already slain one man in your villainy. For that you stand branded a murderer. God alone knows what death and destruction this strike in the hills may bring about. And all of it is aimed at me. Why? In God's name, why?" Dave's manner was that of cold argument. He displayed none of the passion that really stirred him. He longed to take this man in his two great hands and crush the mean life out of him. But nothing of such feeling was allowed to show itself. He began to fill his pipe. He did not want to smoke, but it gave his hands something to do, and just then his hands demanded something to do. His words elicited no reply. Truscott's eyes were upon the hands fumbling at the bowl of the pipe. He was not really observing them. He was wrapped in his own thoughts, and his eyes simply fixed themselves on the only moving thing in the room. Dave put his pipe in his mouth and refolded his pouch. Presently he went on speaking, and his tone became warmer and his words more rapid. "There was a time when you were a man, a decent, honest, happy man, a youngster with all the world before you. At that time I did all in my power to help you. You remember? You ran that mill. It was a matter of hanging on and waiting till fortune turned your way for success and prosperity to come. Then one day you came to me, you and she. It was decided that you should go away, to seek your fortune elsewhere. We shook hands. Do you remember? You left her in my care. All this seems like yesterday. I promised you then that always, in the name of friendship, you could command me. Your trust I carried out to the letter, and all I promised I was ready to fulfill. Need I remind you of what has happened since? Need I draw a picture of the drunkard, gambler who returned to Malkern, of the insults you have put upon her, everybody? Of her patience and loyalty? Of the manner in which you finally made it impossible for her to marry you? It is not necessary. You know it all, if you are the same man, which I am beginning to doubt. And now, why are you doing all this? I intend to know. I mean to drag it out of you before you leave this room." He had risen from his seat and stood before his captive with one hand outstretched in his direction, grasping his pipe by the bowl. His calmness had gone. A passion of angry protest surged through his veins. He was no longer the cool, clear-headed master of the mills, but a man swept by a fury of resentment at the injustice, the wanton, devilish, mischievous injustice of one whom he had always befriended. Friendship was gone, and in its place there burned the human desire for retaliation. Truscott's introspective stare changed to a wicked laugh. It was forced, and had for its object the intention of goading the other. Dave calmed immediately. He understood that laugh in time, and so it failed in his purpose and died out. In its place the man's face darkened. It was he who fell a victim to his own intention. All his hatred for his one-time friend rose within him suddenly and swept him on its burning tide. "You're standing there preaching! You!" he cried with a ferocity so sudden that it became appalling. "You dare to preach to me of honesty, of friendship, of promises fulfilled? You? God, it makes me boil to hear you. If ever there was a traitor to friendship in this world, it is you. I came back to marry Betty. Why else should I come back? And I find what? She is changed. You have seen to that. For a time she kept up the pretense of our engagement. Then she seized upon the first excuse to break it. Why? For you. Oh, your trust was well fulfilled. You lost no time in my absence. Who was it I found her with on my return? You. Who was present to give her courage and support when she refused to marry me? You. Do you think I haven't seen the way it has all been worked? You have secured her uncle's and aunt's support. You. You have taken her from me. You. And you preach friendship and honesty to me. God, but you're a liar and a thief." For a moment the lumberman's fury leapt, and in another he would have crushed the man's life out of him, but in a flash his whole mood changed. The accusations were so absurd even from his own point of view. Could it be? For a moment he believed that the loss of Betty had unhinged Truscott's mind. But the thought passed, and he grew as calm now as a moment before he had been furious, and an icy sternness chilled him through and through. There was no longer a vestige of pity in him for his accuser. He sat down and lit his pipe, his heavy face set with the iron that had entered his soul. "You have lied to yourself until you have come to believe it," he said sternly. "You have lied because it is your nature to lie, because you have not an honest thought in your mind. I'll not answer your accusations, because they are so hopelessly absurd, but I'll tell you what I intend to do." "You won't answer them because you cannot deny them," Truscott broke in furiously. "They are true, and you know it. You have stolen her from me. You! Oh, God, I hate you!" His voice rose to a strident shout, and Dave raised a warning hand. "Keep quiet," he commanded coldly. "I have listened to you, and now you shall listen to me." The fire in the other's eyes still shone luridly, but he became silent under the coldly compelling manner, while, like a savage beast, He crouched in his chair, ready to break out into passionate protest at the least chance. "I don't know yet how far things have gone in the way you wish them to go up there in the hills, but you have found the way to accomplish your end in ruining me. If the strike continues, I tell you frankly you will have done what you have set out to do. My resources are taxed now to the limit. That will rejoice you." Truscott grinned savagely as he sprang in with his retort. "The strike is thoroughly established, and there are those up there who'll see it through. Yes, yes, my friend, it is my doing, all my doing, and it cannot fail me now. The money I took from you for the mill I laid out well. I laid out more than that, practically all I had in the world. Oh, I spared nothing. I had no intention of failing. I would give even my life to ruin you. Don't be too sure you may not yet have to pay that price," Dave said grimly. "Willingly." Truscott's whole manner carried conviction. Dave read in the sudden clipping of his teeth, the deadly light of his eyes, the clenching of his hands, that he meant it. "I'll ruin you even if I die for it, but I'll see you ruined first," cried Truscott. "You have miscalculated one thing, Truscott," Dave said slowly. "You have forgotten that you are in my power, and a captive. However, we'll let that go for the moment. I promise you you shall never live to see me suffer in the way you hope. You shall not even be aware of it. I care nothing for the ruin you hope for, so far as I am personally concerned, but I do care for other reasons. In dragging me down, you will drag Malkern down, too. You will ruin many others. You will even involve Betty in the crash, for she, like the rest of us, is bound up in Malkern. And in this you will hurt me as in your wildest dreams you never expected to do." Then he leaned forward in his seat, and a subtle, deliberate intensity, more deadly for the very frigidity of his tone, was in his whole attitude. His hands were outstretched toward his captive, his fingers were extended and bent at the joints, like talons ready to clutch and rend their prey. "Now, I tell you this," he went on, "as surely as harm comes to Betty up in that camp, through any doings of yours, as surely as ruin through your agency descends upon this valley, as Almighty God is my judge, I will tear the life out of you with my own two hands." For a moment Truscott's eyes supported the frigid glare of Dave's. For a moment he had it in his mind to fling defiance at him. Then his eyes shifted and he looked away, and defiance died out of his mind. The stronger nature shook the weaker, and an involuntary shudder of apprehension slowly crept over him. Dave, stirred to the pitch of threatening deliberate slaughter, had been beyond his imagination. Now that he saw it, the sight was not pleasant. Suddenly the lumberman sprang to his feet. "We'll start right away," he said, in his usual voice. "We?" The monosyllabic question sprang from Truscott's lips in a sudden access of fear. "Yes, we. Mason, you, and me." End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 26 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 26. To the Lumber Camp. The gray morning mist rolled slowly up the hillsides from the bosom of the warming valley below. Great billows mounted, swelling in volume till, overweighted, they toppled, surging like the breaking rollers of a wind-swept ocean. Here and there the rosy sunlight brushed the swirling sea with a tenderness of color no painter's brush could ever hope to produce. A precocious sunbeam shot athwart the leaden prospect. It bored its way through the churning fog, searching the depths of some benighted wood-lined hollow, as though to rouse its slumbering world. Dense spruce and hemlock forests grew out of the mists. The spires of gigantic pines rose, piercing the gray as though gasping for the warming radiance above. A perching eagle, newly roused from its slumbers, shrieked its morning song till the rebounding cries, echoing from 1,000 directions, suggested the reveille of the entire feathered world. The mournful whistle of a solitary marmot swelled the song from many new directions, and the raucous chorus had for its accompaniment the thundering chords of hidden waters, seething and boiling in the mighty cañons below. The long-drawn, sibilant hush of night was gone. The leaden mountain dawn had passed. Day, glorious in its waking splendor, had routed the grim shadows from the mystic depths of cañon, from the leaden-hued forest-laden valleys. The sunlight was upon the dazzling mountain tops, groping, searching for the very heart of the Rocky Mountains. Dave's buckboard, no more conspicuous than some wandering ant in the vast mountain world, crawled from the depths of a wide valley and slowly mounted the shoulders of a forest-clad ridge. It vanished into the twilight of giant woods, only to be seen again, some hours later, at a greater altitude, climbing the great slopes, or descending to gaping hollows, but always attaining the higher lands. But his speed was by no means a crawl in reality, only did it appear so by reason of the vastness of the world about him. His horses were traveling as fresh, mettlesome beasts can travel when urged by such a man as Dave, with his nerves strung to a terrific tension by the emergency of his journey. The willing beasts raced down the hills over the uneven trail with all the sure-footed carelessness of the prairie-bred bronco. They took the inclines with scarcely perceptible slackening of their gait, and only the sharp hill served them for breathing space. Dave occupied the driving seat, while Mason sat guard over Jim Truscott in the carryall behind. Those 2 days on the trail had been unusually silent, even for men such as they were, and even taking into consideration the object of their journey. Truscott and Mason were almost dead beat with all that had gone before, and Dave, he was wrapped in his own thoughts. His thoughts carried him far away from his companions into a world where love and strife were curiously blended. Every thread of such thought sent him blundering into mires of trouble, the possibilities of which set his nerves jangling with apprehension. But their contemplation only stiffened his stern resolve to fight the coming battle with a courage and resource such as never yet had he brought to bear in his bid for success. He knew that before him lay the culminating battle of his long and ardent sieging of Fortune's stronghold. He knew that now, at last, he was face to face with the great test of his fitness. He knew that this battle had always been bound to come before the goal of his success was reached, although, perhaps, its method and its cause may have taken 1,000 other forms. It is not in the nature of things that a man may search untested straight to the golden pastures of his ambitions. He must fight every foot of his way, and the final battle must ever be the sternest, the crudest. God help the man if he has not the fitness, for fate and fortune are remorseless foes. But besides his native courage, Dave was stirred to even greater efforts by man's strongest motive, be his cause for good or evil. Love was the mainspring of his inspiration. He had desired success with a passionate longing all his life, and his success was not all selfishness. But now, before all things, he saw the sweetly gentle face of Betty Somers gazing with a heartful appeal, beckoning him, calling him to help her. Every moment of that long journey the vision remained with him. Every moment he felt might be the moment of dire tragedy for her. He dared not trust himself to consider the nature of that tragedy, or he must have turned and rended the man who was its cause. Only he blessed each moment that passed, bringing him nearer to her side. He loved her as he loved nothing and no one else on earth, and somehow there had crept into his mind the thought of a possibility he had never yet dared to consider. It was a vague ray of hope that the impossibility of his love was not so great as he had always believed. How it had stolen in upon him he hardly knew. Perhaps it was his mother's persistent references to Betty. Perhaps it was the result of his talk with the man who had brought her to the straits she was now placed in. Perhaps it was one of these things, or both, coupled with the memory of trifling incidents in the past, which had seemed to mean nothing at the time of their happening. Whatever it was, his love for the girl swept through him now in a way that drove him headlong to her rescue. His own affairs of the mills, the fate of his friends in Malkern, of the village itself, all these things were driven into the background of his thoughts. Betty needed him. The thought set his brain whirling with a wild, thrilling happiness, mazed, every alternate moment, with a horrible fear that drove him to the depths of despair. It was high noon when smoke ahead warned him that the journey was nearly over. The buckboard was on the ridge shouldering a wide valley, and below it was the rushing torrent of the Red Sand River. From his position, Dave had a full view of the dull green forest world rolling away, east and west, in vast undulating waves as far as the eye could reach. Only to the south, beyond the valley, was there a break in the dense, verdant carpet. And here it was he beheld the telltale smoke of the lumber camp. "That's the camp," he said, looking straight ahead, watching the slowly rising haze with longing eyes. "Guess we haven't to cross the river. Good." Mason was looking out over his shoulder. "No," he said after a moment's pause, while he tried to read the signs he beheld. "We don't cross the river. Keep to the trail. It takes us right past my shack." "Where Parson Tom and—" "Yes, where they're living." In another quarter of a mile they would be descending the hollow of a small valley diverging from the valley of the Red Sand River. As they drew near the decline, Dave spoke again. "Can you make anything out, Mason?" he asked. "Seems to me that smoke is thick for stovepipes. There's 2 lots, one of 'em nearer this way." Mason stared out for some moments, shielding his eyes from the dazzling sun. "I can't be sure," he said at last. "The nearest smoke should be my shack." A grave anxiety crept into Dave's eyes. "It isn't thick there," he said, as though trying to reassure himself. "That's your stovepipe?" "Maybe." Mason's reply expressed doubt. Suddenly Dave leaned over, and his whip fell sharply across the horses' backs. They sprang at their neck yoke and raced down into the final dip. End of chapter 26. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 27 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 27 At Bay. In the dugout Tom Chepstow was standing with his ear pressed against the door jamb. He was listening, straining with every nerve alert to glean the least indication of what was going on outside. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes shone with anxiety. He was gripped by a fear he had never known before, a fear that might well come to the bravest. Personal, physical danger he understood. It was almost pleasant to him, something that gave life a new interest. But this was different. This was horrible. Betty was standing just behind him. She was leaning forward, craning intently. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and a similar dread was looking out of her soft eyes. Her face was pale with a marble coldness, her rich red lips were compressed to a fine line, her whole body was tense with the fear that lay behind her straining eyes. There was desperation in the poise of her body, the desperation of a brave woman who sees the last hope vanishing, swallowed up in a tide of disaster she is powerless to stem. For nearly a week these two had been penned up in the hut. But for the last 36 hours their stronghold had actually been in a state of siege. From the time of her uncle's realization of the conditions obtaining outside, Betty had not ventured without the building, while the man himself had been forced to use the utmost caution in moving abroad. It had been absolutely necessary for him to make several expeditions, otherwise he too would have remained in their fortress. They required water and firewood, and these things had to be procured. Then, too, there were the sick. But on the third day the climax was reached. Returning from one of his expeditions, Chepstow encountered a drunken gang of lumberjacks. Under the influence of their recent orgy, their spirit-soaked brains had conceived the pretty idea of "oilin' the passions works," in other words, forcing drink upon him, and making him as drunk as themselves. In their present condition the joke appealed to them, and it was not without a violent struggle that their intended victim escaped. He was carrying firewood at the time, and it served him well as a weapon of defense. In a few brief moments he had left one man stunned upon the ground, and another with a horribly broken face, and was himself racing for the dugout. He easily outstripped his drunken pursuers, but he was quickly to learn how high a price he must pay for the temporary victory. He had brought a veritable hornet's nest about his ears. The mischief began. The attack upon himself had only been a drunken practical joke. The subsequent happenings were in deadly earnest. The mob came in a blaze of savage fury. Their first thought was for vengeance upon him. In all probability, up to that time Betty's presence in the hut had been forgotten, but now, as they came to the dugout, they remembered. In their present condition it was but a short step from a desire to revenge themselves upon him to the suggestion of how it could be accomplished through the girl. They remembered her pretty face, her delicious woman's figure, and instantly they became ravening brutes, fired with a mad desire to possess themselves of her. They were no longer strikers, they were not even men. The spirit taken from the burning store had done its work. A howling pack of demons had been turned loose upon the camp, ready for any fiendish prank, ready for slaughter, ready for anything. These untutored creatures knew no better. They were powerless to help themselves. Their passions alone guided them at all times, and now all that was most evil in them was frothing to the surface. Sober, they were as tame as caged wolves kept under by the bludgeon of a stern discipline. Drunk, they were madmen, driven by the untamed passions of the brute creation. They were animals, without the restraining instincts of the animal. They lusted for the exercise of their great muscles, and the vital forces which swept through their veins in a passionate torrent. Their first effort was a demand for the surrender of those in the hut, and they were coldly refused. They attempted a parley, and received no encouragement. Now they were determined upon capture, with loudly shouted threats of dire consequences for the defenders' obstinacy. It was close upon noon of the second day of the siege. The hut was barricaded at every point. Door and windows were blocked up with every available piece of furniture that could be spared, and the repeating rifles were loaded ready, and both uncle and niece were armed with revolvers. They were defending more than life and liberty, and they knew it. They were defending all that is most sacred in a woman's life. It was a ghastly thought, a desperate thought, but a thought that roused in them both a conviction that any defense brain could conceive was justified. If necessary, not even life itself should stand in the way of their defense. The yellow lamplight threw gloomy shadows about the barricaded room. Its depressing light added to the sinister aspect of their extremity. The silence was ominous. It was fraught with a portend of disaster, disaster worse than death. How could they hope to withstand the attack of the men outside? They were waiting for what was to happen. Every conceivable method had been adopted by the besiegers to dislodge their intended victims. They had tried to tear the roof off, but the heavy logs were well dovetailed, and the process would have taken too long and exposed those attempting it to the fire of the rifles in the capable hands of the defenders. Chepstow had illustrated his determination promptly by a half-dozen shots fired at the first moving of one of the logs. Then had come an assault on the door, but, here again, the ready play of the rifle from one of the windows had driven these besiegers hurriedly to cover. Some man, more blinded with drink than the rest of his comrades, had suggested fire, but his suggestion was promptly vetoed. Had it been the parson only, they would probably have had no scruples, but Betty was there, and they wanted Betty. For some time there had been no further assault. "I wish I knew how many there were," Chepstow said in a low voice. "Would that do any good?" The man moved his shoulders in something like a despairing shrug. "Would anything do any good?" "Nothing I can think of," Betty murmured bitterly. "I thought if there were, say, only a dozen, I might open this door. We have the repeating rifles." The man's eyes, as he spoke, glittered with a fierce light. Betty saw it, and somehow it made her shiver. It brought home to her their extremity even more poignantly than all that had gone before. When a brave churchman's thoughts concentrated in such a direction, she felt that their hopes were small indeed. She shook her head. "No, uncle dear, we must wait for that until they force an entrance." She was cool enough in her desperation, cooler far than he. "Yes," he nodded reluctantly, "perhaps you're right. But the suspense is killing. Hark! Listen, they are coming at us again. I wonder what it is to be this time." The harsh voices of the drunken mob could be plainly heard. They were coming nearer. Brutal laughter assailed the straining ears inside, and set their nerves tingling afresh. Then came a hush. It lasted some seconds. Then a single laugh just outside the door broke upon the silence. "Try again," a voice said. "Say, here's some more." "'Struth, you're a heap of goddamn foolishness," another voice broke in angrily. "God strike you," it snarled. "Do it your bastard self." "Right ho." Then there came a shuffling of feet, and, a moment later, a scraping and scratching at the foot of the door. Chepstow glanced down at it, and Betty's eyes were irresistibly drawn in the same direction. "What are they doing now?" It was the voice of the wounded strike leader on his bunk at the far end of the room. He was staring over at the door, his expression one of even greater fear than that of the defenders themselves. He felt that, in spite of the part he had played in bringing the strike about, his position was no better than these others. If anything happened to them, all help for him was gone. Besides, he too understood that these men outside were no longer strikers, but wolves, whiskey-soaked savages beyond the control of any strike leader. He received no reply. The scraping went on. Something was being thrust into the gaping crack, which stood an inch wide beneath the door. Suddenly the noise ceased, followed by a long pause. Then, in the strong draught under the door, a puff of oil smoke belched into the room, and its nauseous reek set Chepstow coughing. His cough brought an answering peal of brutal laughter from beyond the door, and someone shouted to his comrades, "Bully for you, Bo! Draw 'em like badgers! Smoke 'em out like gophers!" The pungent smoke belched into the room, and the man darted from the door. "Quick!" he cried. "Wet rags! A blanket!" Betty sprang to his assistance. The room was rapidly filling with smoke, which stung their eyes and set them choking. A blanket was snatched off the wounded strike leader, but the process of saturating it was slow. They had only one barrel of water, and dared not waste it by plunging the blanket into it, so they were forced to resort to the use of a dipper. At last it was ready, and the man crushed it down at the foot of the door and stamped it tight with his foot. But it had taken too much time to set in place. The room was dense with a fog of smoke that set eyes streaming and throats gasping. In reckless despair, the man sprang at one of the windows and began to tear down the carefully built barricade. But now the cunning of the besiegers was displayed. As the last of the barricade was removed, Chepstow discovered that the cotton covering of the window was smoldering. He tore it out to let in the fresh air, but only to release a pile of smoldering oil rags, which had been placed on the thickness of the wall, and set it tumbling into the room. The window was barricaded on the outside. The smoke became unbearable now, and the two prisoners set to work to trample the smoldering rags out. It was while they were thus occupied that a fresh disaster occurred. There was a terrific clatter at the stove, and a cloud of smoke and soot practically put the place in darkness. Nor did it need the sound of scrambling feet on the roof to tell those below what had happened. The strikers, by removing the topmost joint of the pipe, where it protruded through the roof, had been able, by the aid of a long stick, to dislodge the rest of the pipe and send it crashing to the floor. It was a master stroke of diabolical cunning, for now, added to the smoke and soot, the sulphurous fumes of the blazing stove rendered the conditions of the room beyond further endurance. Half blinded and gasping, Chepstow sprang at the table and seized a rifle. Betty had dropped into a chair, choking. The strike leader lay moaning, trying to shut out the smoke with his one remaining blanket. "Come on, Betty!" shouted the man, in a frenzy of rage. "You've got your revolver. I'm going to open the door, and may God Almighty have mercy on the soul of the man who tries to stop us." End of chapter 27. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 28 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 28. Dave the Man. Dave's buckboard swept up the slope of the last valley. It reached the dead level of the old travoy trail, which passed in front of Mason's dugout on its way to the lumber camp. He was looking ahead for signs which he feared to discover. He wanted the reason of the smoke he had seen from afar off. But now a perfect screen of towering pine forest lined the way, and all that lay beyond was hidden from his anxious eyes. He flogged his horses faster. The perfect mountain calm was unbroken. Even the speeding horses and the rattle of his buckboard were powerless to disturb that stupendous quiet. It was a mere circumstance in a world too vast to take color from a detail so insignificant. It was that wonderful peace, that thrilling silence that aggravated his fears. His apprehension grew with each passing moment, and though he made no display, his clutch upon the reins, the sharpness with which he plied his whip, the very immobility of his face, all told their tale of feelings strung to a high pitch. Mason was standing directly behind him in the carryall. He steadied himself with a grip upon the back of the driving seat. Beside him the wretched Truscott was sitting on the jolting slats of the body of the vehicle, mercilessly thrown about by the bumping over the broken trail. Mason, too, was staring out ahead. "Seems quiet enough," he murmured, half to himself. Dave caught at his words. "That's how it seems," he said, in a tone of doubt. "It's less than half a mile now," Mason went on a moment later. "We're coming to the Big Bend." Dave nodded. His whip fell across the horse's quarters. "Best get ready," he said significantly. Then he laughed mirthlessly and tried to excuse himself. "I don't guess there'll be a heap of trouble, though." "No." Mason's reply carried no conviction. Both men were in doubt. Neither knew what to expect. Neither knew in what way to prepare for the meeting that was now so near. Now the trail began to swing out to the right. It was the beginning of the Big Bend. The walls of forest about them receded slightly, opening out where logs had been felled beside the trail in years past. The middle of the curve was a small clearing. Then, further on, as it inclined against to the left, it narrowed down to the bare breadth of the trail. "Just beyond this—" Mason broke off. His words were cut short by a loud shout just ahead of them. It was a shout of triumph and gleeful enjoyment. Dave's whip fell again, and the horses laid on to their traces. From that moment to the moment when the horses were almost flung upon their haunches by the sudden jolt with which Dave pulled them up was a matter of seconds only. He was out of the buckboard, too, having flung the reins to Mason, and was standing facing a small group of a dozen men whom it was impossible to recognize as lumberjacks. In truth, there were only 3 of them who were. The others were some of those Mason had been forced to engage in his extremity. At the sight of Dave's enormous figure, a cry broke from the crowd. Then they looked at the buckboard with its panting horses, and Mason standing in the carryall, one hand on the reins and one resting on the revolver on his hip. Their cry died out. But as it did so, another broke from their midst. It was Betty's voice, and her uncle's. There was a scuffle and a rush. Gripping the girl by the arm, Tom Chepstow burst from their midst and ran to Dave's side, dragging Betty with him. "Thank God!" he cried. But there was no answering joy from Dave. He scarcely even seemed to see them. A livid, frozen rage glared out of his eyes. His face was terrible to behold. He moved forward. His gait was cat-like, His head was thrust forward. It was almost as if he tiptoed and was about to spring upon the mob. As he came within a yard of the foremost of the men he halted, and one great arm shot out, with its fist clenching. "Back!" he roared. "Back to your camp, every man of you! Back, you cowardly hounds!" There were 12 of them, fierce, savage, half-drunken men. They cared for no one. They feared no one. They were ready to follow whithersoever their passions led them. There was not a man among them that would not fight with the last breath in his body. Yet they hesitated at the sound of that voice. They almost shrank before that passion-lit face. The man's enormous stature was not without awe for them. And in that moment of hesitation the battle was won for Dave. Chepstow's repeating rifle was at his shoulder, and Mason's revolver had been whipped out of its holster and was held covering them. Suddenly there was a movement in the crowd, somewhere behind. If Dave saw it, he gave no sign. But Mason saw it, and, sharply incisive, his voice rang out, "The first man that moves this way, I'll shoot him like a dog." Instantly every eye among the strikers was turned upon the 2 men with their ready weapons, and to a man they understood that the game was up. "Get out! Get out quick!" Dave's great voice split the air with another deep roar. And the retreat began on the instant with those in the rear. Someone started to run, and in a moment the rest had joined in a rush for the camp, vanishing into the forest like a pack of timber wolves, flinging back fierce, vengeful glances over their shoulders at those who had so easily routed them. No one stirred till the last man had disappeared. Then Dave turned. "Quick!" he cried, in an utterly changed voice. "Get into the buckboard!" But Betty turned to him in a half-hysterical condition. "Oh, Dave, Dave!" she cried helplessly. But Dave was just now a man whom none of them had ever seen before. He had words for no one, not even for Betty. He suddenly caught her in his arms and lifted her bodily into the buckboard. He scrambled in after her, while Chepstow jumped up behind. In a moment, it seemed, they were racing headlong for the camp. The camp was in a ruinous condition. The destructive demon in men temporarily demented was abroad, and his ruthless hand had fallen heavily. The whole atmosphere suggested the red tide of anarchy. The charred remains of the sutler's store was the center of a net of ruin spread out in every direction, and from this radiated the wreckage of at least a dozen shanties, which had, like the store, been burned to the ground. In the circumstances it would be impossible to guess at the reason for such destruction. Maybe it was the result of carelessness, maybe a mischievous delight in sweeping away that which reminded these men of their obligations to their employer. Maybe it was merely a consequence of the settlement of their own drunken feuds. Whatever the cause, the hideous effect of the strike was apparent in every direction. In the center of the clearing was a great gathering of the lumbermen. Their seared faces expressed every variety of mental attitude, from fierce jocularity down to the blackest hatred of interference from those whose authority had become anathema to them. They were gathered at the call of those who had fled from the dugout, spurred to a defense of what they believed to be their rights by a hurried, garbled account of the summary treatment just meted out to them. They were ready for more than the mere assertion of their demands. They were ready to enforce them. They were ready for any mischief which the circumstances prompted. It was a deadly array. Many were sober, many were sobering, many were still drunk. The latter were those whose cunning had prompted them, at the outset of the strike, to secrete a sufficient supply of liquor from their fellows. And the majority of these were not the real lumberjacks, those great simple children of the forest, but the riffraff that had drifted into the camp, or had been sent thither by those who prompted the strike. The real lumberjacks were more or less incapable of such foresight and cunning. They were slow-thinking creatures of vast muscle, only swift and keen as the axes they used when engaged in the work which was theirs. Through the rank animal growth of their bodies their minds had remained too stunned to display the low cunning of the scallywags, whose unscrupulous wits alone must supply their idle bodies with a livelihood. But, simple as babes, simple and silly as sheep, and as dependent upon their shepherd as these men were, they were at all times dangerous, the more dangerous for their very simplicity. Just now, with their unthinking brains sick with the poison of labor's impossible argument, and the execrable liquor of the camp, they were 100 times more deadly. Men had come in for the orgy from all the outlying camps. They had been carefully shepherded by those whose business it was to make the strike successful. Discontent had been preached into every ear, and the seed had fallen upon fruitful virgin soil. Thus it was that a great concourse had foregathered now. There was an atmosphere of restrained excitement abroad among them. For them the news of Dave's arrival had tremendous possibilities. A babel of harsh voices debated the situation in loud tones, each man forcing home his argument with a mighty power of lung, a never-failing method of supporting doubtful argument. The general attitude was threatening, yet it hardly seemed to be unanimous. There was too much argument. There seemed to be an undercurrent of uncertainty with no single capable voice to check or guide it. As the moments sped, the crowd became more and more threatening, but whether against the master of the mills, or whether the result of hot blood and hot words, it would have been difficult to say. Then, just as the climax seemed to be approaching, a magical change swept over the throng. It was wrought by the sudden appearance of Dave's buckboard, which seemed to leap upon the scene from the depth of the forest. And as it came into view a hoarse, fierce shout went up. Then, in a moment, an expectant hush fell. Dave's eyes were fixed upon the crowd before him. He gave no sign. His face, like a mask, was cold, hard, unyielding. No words were spoken by those in the buckboard. Every one, with nerves straining and pulses throbbing, was waiting for what was to happen. Every one except the prisoner, Truscott. The master of the mills read the meaning of what he beheld with the sureness of a man bred to the calling of these men. He knew, and, knowing, he had little blame for them. How could it be otherwise with these unthinking souls? The blame must lie elsewhere. But his sympathy left his determination unaltered. He knew, no one better, that here the iron heel alone could prevail, and for the time his heel was shod for the purpose. He drew near. Someone shouted a furious epithet at him, and the cry was taken up by the others. The horses shied. He swung back at them with a heavy hand, and forced them to face the crowd, his whip falling viciously at the same time. But, for a moment, his face relaxed its cold expression. His quick ears had detected a lack of unanimity in the execration. Suddenly he pulled the horses up. He passed the reins to Mason and leaped to the ground. It was a stirring moment. The mob advanced, but the movement seemed almost reluctant. It was not the rush of blind fury one might have expected, but rather as though it were due to pressure from behind by those under cover of their comrades in front. Dave moved on to meet them, and those in the buckboard remained deathly still. Mason was the first to move. He had just become aware that Dave had left his revolver on the seat of the vehicle. Instantly he lifted the reins and walked the horses closer to the crowd. "He's unarmed," he said, in explanation to the parson. Chepstow nodded. He moved his repeating rifle to a handier position. Betty looked up. "He left that gun purposely," she said. "I saw him." Her face was ghastly pale, but a light shone in her eyes which nobody could have failed to interpret. Mason saw it and no longer hesitated. "Will you take these reins?" he said, "and give me your revolver." The girl understood and obeyed in silence. "I think there will be trouble," Mason went on a moment later, as he saw Dave halt within a few yards of the front rank of the strikers. He watched the men close about his chief in a semicircle, but the buckboard in rear always held open a road for retreat. Now the crowd pressed up from behind. The semicircle became dense. Those in the buckboard saw that many of the men were carrying the tools of their calling, prominent among them being the deadly peavey, than which, in case of trouble, no weapon could be more dangerous at close quarters. As he halted, Dave surveyed the sea of rough, hard faces glowering upon him. He heard the mutterings. He saw the great bared arms and the knotty hands grasping the hafts of their tools. He saw all this and understood, but the sight in no way disturbed him. His great body was erect, his cold eyes unwavering. It was the unconscious pose of a man who feels the power to control within him. "Well?" he inquired with an easy drawl. Instantly there was silence everywhere. It was the critical moment. It was the moment when, before all things, he must convince these lawless creatures of his power, his reserve of commanding force. "Well?" he demanded again. "Where's your leader? Where's the gopher running this layout? I've come right along to talk to you boys to see if we can't straighten this trouble out. Where's your leader, the man who was hired to make you think I wasn't treating you right? Where is he? Speak up, boys. I can't rightly hear all you're saying. I want to parley with your leaders." Mason, listening to the great voice of the lumberman, chuckled inaudibly. He realized something of Dave's method, and the shrewdness of it. The mutterings had begun afresh. Some of the front rank men drew nearer. Dave did not move. He wanted an answer. He wanted an indication of their actual mood. Somebody laughed in the crowd. It was promptly shouted down. It was the indication the master of the mills sought. They wanted to hear what he had to say. He allowed the ghost of a smile to play round the corners of his stern mouth for a moment. But his attitude remained uncompromising. His back stiffened, his great shoulders squared, he stood out a giant amongst those giants of the forest. "Where's your man?" he cried, in a voice that could be heard by everybody. "Is he backing down? That's not like a lumberjack. Perhaps he's not a lumberjack. Perhaps he's got no clear argument I can't answer. Perhaps he hasn't got the grit to get out in the open and talk straight as man to man. Well, let it go at that. Guess you'd bet set one of you up as spokesman. I've got all the time you need to listen." "Your blasted skunk of a foreman shot him down," cried a voice in the crowd, and it was supported by ominous murmurs from the rest. "By God, and Mason was right," cried Dave, in a voice so fierce that it promptly silenced the murmurs. His dilating eyes rested on several familiar faces. The faces of men who had worked for him for years, men whose hair was graying in the service of the woods. He also flashed his lightning glance upon faces unfamiliar, strangers to his craft. "By God, he was right," he repeated, as though to force the violence of his opinion upon them. "I could have done it myself. And why? Because he has come here and told you you are badly treated. He's told you the tale that the profits of this work of yours belong to you. He's told you I am an oppressor, who lives by the sweat of your labors. He tells you this because he is paid to tell you, because he is paid by those who wish to ruin my mills and put me out of business, and so rob you of all the living I have made it possible for you to earn. You refuse to work at his bidding. What is the result? My mill is closed down. I am ruined. These forests are my right to cut. There is no more cutting to be done. You starve. Yes, you starve like wolves in winter. You'll say you can get work elsewhere. Go and get it, and you'll starve till you get it at half the wage I pay you. I am telling you what is right. I am talking to you with the knowledge of my own ruin staring me in the face. You have been told you can squeeze me, you can squeeze a fraction more of pay out of me. But you can't, not 1 cent, any man of you. And if you go to work again to keep our ship afloat, you'll have to work harder than ever before, for the same pay. Now, pass up your spokesman, and I'll talk to him. I can't bellow for all the world to hear." It was a daring beginning, so daring that those on the buckboard gasped in amazement. But Dave knew his men, or at least he knew the real lumberjack. Straight, biting talk must serve him, or nothing would. Now followed a buzz of excited talk. There were those among the crowd who from the beginning had had doubts, and to these Dave's words appealed. He had voiced something of what they had hazily thought. Others there were who were furious at his biting words. Others again, and these were not real lumberjacks, who were for turning upon him the savage brutality of their drink-soaked brains. An altercation arose. It was the dispute of factions suddenly inflamed. It was somewhere in rear of the crowd. Those in front turned to learn the cause. Dave watched and listened. He understood. It was the result of his demand for a spokesman. Opinions were divided, and a dozen different men were urged forward. He knew he must check the dispute. Suddenly his voice rang out above the din. "It's no use snarling about it like a lot of coyotes," he roared. "Pass them all through, and I'll listen to 'em all. Now, boys, pass 'em through peaceably." One of the men in front of him supported him. "Aye, aye," he shouted. "That's fair, boys. Bring 'em along. The boss'll talk 'em straight." The man beside him hit him sharply in the ribs, and the broad-shouldered Jack swung around. "There ain't no boss to this layout, Peter," objected the man who had dealt the blow. "Yonder fellow ain't no better'n us." The man scowled threateningly as he spoke. He was an enormous brute, with a sallow, ill-tempered face, and black hair. Dave heard the words, and his eyes surveyed him closely. He saw at a glance there was nothing of the lumberman about him. He set him down at once as a French-Canadian bully, probably one of the men instrumental in the strike. However, his attention was now drawn to the commotion caused by 6 of the lumbermen being pushed to the front as spokesmen. They joined the front rank and stood sheepishly waiting for their employer. Custom and habit were strong upon them, and a certain awe of the master of the mills affected them. "Now we'll get going," Dave said, noting with satisfaction that 4 of the 6 were old hands who had worked beside him in his early days. "Well, boys, let's have it. What's your trouble? Give us the whole story." But as spokesmen these fellows were not brilliant. They hesitated, and finally, with something approaching a shamefaced grin, one of them spoke up. It's just wages, boss." "Leave it at wages, Bob," shouted a voice at the back of the crowd. "Yes," snarled the sallow-faced giant near by. "We're just man to man. There ain't no bosses around." "Ha!" Dave breathed the ejaculation. Then he turned his eyes, steely hard, upon the last speaker, and his words came in an unmistakable tone. "It seems there are men here who aren't satisfied with their spokesman. Maybe they'll speak out good and plenty instead of interrupting." His challenge seemed to appeal to the original spokesman, for he laughed roughly. "Say, boss," he cried, "he don't cut no ice anyways. He's just a bum road maker. He ain't been in camp more'n 6 weeks. We don't pay no 'tention to him. You see, boss," he went on, emphasizing the last word purposely, "it's just wages. We're workin' a sight longer hours than is right, an' we ain't gettin' nothin' extra 'cept the rise you gave us 3 months back. Well, we're wantin' more. That's how." He finished up his clumsy speech with evident relief, and mopped his forehead with his ham-like hand. "And since when, Bob Nicholson, have you come to this conclusion?" demanded Dave, with evident kindliness. His tone produced instant effect upon the man. He became easier at once, and his manner changed to one of distinct friendliness. "Well, boss, I can't rightly say just when, for sure. Guess it must have been when that orator fellow got around—" "Shut up!" roared someone in the crowd, and the demand was followed up by distinct cursing in several directions. The sallow-faced road-maker seized his opportunity. "It's wages we want, and wages we're going to get," he shouted so that the crowd could hear. "You're sweatin' us, that's what you're doin', sweatin' us, to make your pile a sight bigger. We're honest men up here. We ain't skunks what wants what isn't our lawful rights. If you're yearnin' for extra work, you gotta pay for it. What say, boys?" "Aye, that's it, extra wages," cried a number of voices in the background. But again the chorus was not unanimous. There were those, too, in the front whose scowling faces, turned on the speaker, showed their resentment at this interference by a man they did not recognize as a lumberjack. Dave seized his opportunity. "You're wanting extra wages for overtime," he cried, in a voice that carried like a steam siren. "Well, why didn't you ask for them? Why did you go out on strike first and then ask? Why? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why you chose this damned gopher racket, instead of acting like the honest men you boast yourselves to be. I can tell you why you wanted to lock up your camp boss, and so prevent your wishes reaching me. I can tell you why you had men on the road between here and Malkern to stop letters going through. I can tell you why you honest men set fire to the store here, and stole all the liquor and goods in it. I can tell you why you did these things. Because you've just listened like silly sheep to the skunks who've come along since the fever broke out. Because you've listened to the men who've set out to ruin us both, you and me. Because you've listened to these scallywags, who aren't lumbermen, who've come among you. They're not jacks, and they don't understand the work, but they've been drawing the same wages as you, and they're trying to rob you of your living. They're trying to take your jobs from you and leave you nothing. That's why you've done these things, you boys who've worked with me for years and years, and had all you needed. Are you going to let 'em rob you? They are robbing you, for I swear before God my mills are closed down, and they'll remain closed, and every one of you can get out and look for new work unless you turn to at once." A murmur again arose as he finished speaking, but this time there was a note of alarm in it, a note of anger that was not against their employer. Faces looked puzzled, and ended by frowning into the faces of neighbors. Dave understood the effect he had made. He was waiting for a bigger effect. He was fighting for something that was dearer to him than life, and all his courage and resource were out to the limit. He glanced at the sallow-faced giant. Their eyes met, and in his was a fierce challenge. He drew the fellow as easily as any expert swordsman. The man had been shrewd enough to detect the change in his comrades, and he promptly hurled himself into the fray to try and recover the lost ground. He stepped forward, towering over his fellows. He meant mischief. "See, mates," he shouted, trying to put a jeer in his angry voice. "Look at him. He's come here to call us a pack of skunks and gophers. Him what's making thousands of dollars a day out of us. He's come here to kick us like a lot of lousy curs. His own man shot up our leader, him as was trying to fit things right for us. I tell you it was murder, bloody murder. We're dirt to him. He can kick us, shoot us up. We're dogs, lousy yeller dogs we are. You'll listen to his slobbery talk and you'll go to work, and he'll cut your wages lower so he can make thousands more out of you." Then he suddenly swung round on Dave with a fierce oath. "God blast you, it's wages we want, d'ye hear? Wages. And we're goin' to have 'em. You ain't goin' to grind us no longer, mister. You're goin' to sign agreement for a rise of wages of a quarter all around. That's what you're goin' to do." Dave was watching. His opportunity was coming. "I came to talk to honest jacks," he said icily, "not to blacklegs. I'll trouble you to get right back into the crowd, and hide your ugly head, and keep your foul tongue quiet. The boys have got their spokesman." His voice was sharp, but the man failed to apprehend the danger that lay behind it. He was a bigger man than Dave, and maybe, he thought to cow him. Perhaps he didn't realize that the master of the mills was now fighting for his existence. There was an instant's pause, and Dave took a step toward him. "Get back!" he roared. His furious demand precipitated things, as he intended it should. Like lightning the giant whipped out a gun. "I'll show you!" he cried. There was a sharp report, but before he could pull the trigger a second time, Dave's right fist shot out, and a smashing blow on the chin felled him to the ground like a pole-axed ox. As the man fell, Dave turned again to the strikers, and no one noticed that his left arm was hanging helpless at his side. End of chapter 28. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 29 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, a story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 29. The End of the Strike. When the master of the mills faced the men again, he hardly knew what to expect. He could not be sure how they would view his action, or what attitude they would adopt. He had considered well before provoking the sallow-faced giant. He had measured him up carefully. The thing had been premeditated. He knew the influence of physical force upon these men. The question was, had he used it at the right moment? He thought he had. He understood lumbermen. But there were more than lumbermen here, and he knew that it was this element of outsiders with whom he was really contending. The fallen man's pistol was on the ground at his feet. He put a foot upon it, then, glancing swiftly at the faces before him, he became aware of a silence, utter, complete, reigning everywhere. There was astonishment, even something of awe in many of the faces. In others doubt mingled with a scowling displeasure. The thing had happened so suddenly. The firing of the shot had startled them unpleasantly, and they were still looking for the result of it. On this point they had no satisfaction. Only Dave knew, he had reason to. The arm hanging limply at his side, and the throb of pain at his shoulder, left him in no doubt. But he had no intention of imparting his knowledge to anyone else yet. He had not finished the fight which must justify his existence as the owner of the mills. The effect of his encounter was not an unpleasant one on the majority of the men. The use of a fist in the face of a gun was stupendous, even to them. Many of them reveled in the outsider's downfall, and contemplated the grit of their employer with satisfaction. But there were others not so easily swayed. Amongst these were the man's own comrades, men who, like himself, were not real lumbermen, but agitators who had received payment to agitate. Besides these there were those unstable creatures, always to be found in such a community, who had no very definite opinions of their own, but looked for the lead of the majority, ready to side with those who offered the strongest support. All this was very evident in that moment of silence, but the moment passed so quickly that it was impossible to say how far Dave's action had really served him. Suddenly a murmur started. In a few seconds it had risen to a shout. It started with the fallen giant's friends. There was a rush in the crowd, an ominous swaying, as of a struggle going on in its midst. Someone put up a vicious cry that lifted clear above the general din. "Lynch him! Lynch him!" The cry was taken up by the rest of the makeshifts, and some of the doubters. Then came the sudden but inevitable awakening of the slow, fierce brains of the real men of the woods. The awakening brought with it not so much a desire to champion their employer as a resentment that these men they regarded as scallywags should attempt to take initiative in their concerns. It was the rousing of the latent hatred which ever exists in the heart of the legitimate tradesman for the interloper. It caught them in a whirlwind of passion. Their blood rose. All other considerations were forgotten. It mattered nothing the object of that mutiny. All thought of wages, all thought of wrongs between themselves and their employer were banished from their minds. They hated nothing so badly as these men with whom they had worked in apparent harmony. It was at this psychological moment that the final fillip was given. It came from a direction that none of the crowd realized. It came from one who knew the woodsman down to his very core, who had watched every passing mood of the crowd during the whole scene with the intentness of one who only waits his opportunity. It was Bob Mason in the buckboard. "Down with the blacklegs! Down with the dirty scabs!" he shouted. In a moment the battle was raging. There was a wild rush of men, and their steel implements were raised aloft. "Down with the scabs!" The cry echoed and re-echoed in every direction, taken up by every true lumberman. A tumult of shouting and cursing roared everywhere. The crowd broke. It spread out. Groups of struggling combatants were dotted about till the sight suggested nothing so much as a massacre. It was a fight of brutal savagery that would stop short only at actual slaughter. It was the safety valve for the accumulated spleen of a week's hard drinking. It was the only way to steady the shaken, drink-soaked nerves and restore the dull brains to the dead level of a desire to return to work and order. Fortunately, it was a short-lived battle, too. The lumberjacks were the masters from the outset. They were better men, they were harder, they had more sheer grit. Then, too, they were in the majority. The "scabs" began to seek refuge in flight, but not before they had received a chastisement that would remain a sore memory for many days to come. Those who went down in the fight got the iron-shod boots of their adversaries in their ribs, till, in desperation, they scrambled to their feet and took their punishment like men. But the victory was too easy for the lumberjacks' rage to last. Like the wayward, big-hearted children of nature they were, their fury passed as quickly as it had stirred. The terror-stricken flight of those upon whom their rage had turned inspired in them a sort of fiendish amusement, and in this was perhaps the saving of a terrible tragedy. As it was, a few broken limbs, a liberal tally of wounds and bruises, were the harvest of that battle. That, and the final clearing out of the element of discontent. It was victory for the master of the mills. In less than 10 minutes the victors were straggling back from their pursuit of a routed foe. Dave had not moved. He was still standing beside the fallen giant, who was now recovering consciousness from the knockout blow he had received. They came up in small bands, laughing and recounting episodes of the fight. They were in the saving mood for their employer. All thoughts of a further strike had passed out of their simple heads. They came back to Dave, like sheep who, after a wild stampede, have suddenly refound their shepherd, and to him they looked for guidance. And Dave was there for the purpose. He called their attention and addressed them. "Now, boys," he said cheerfully, "you've got nicely rid of that scum, and I'm going to talk to you. We understand each other. We've worked too long together for it to be otherwise. But we don't understand those others who're not lumbermen. Say, maybe you can't all hear me. My voice isn't getting stronger, so I'll just call up that buckboard and stand on it, and talk from there." Amidst a murmur of approval the buckboard was drawn up, and not without tremendous pain Dave scrambled up into the driving seat. Then it was seen by both lumbermen and those in the buckboard that he had left a considerable pool of blood where he had been standing. Betty, with horror in her eyes, turned to him. "What is it?" she began. But he checked her with a look, and turned at once to the men. "I'm first going to tell you about this strike, boys," he said. "After that we'll get to business, and I guess it won't be my fault if we don't figure things out right. Here, do you see this fellow sitting here? Maybe some of you'll recognize him?" He pointed at Jim Truscott sitting in the carryall. His expression was surly, defiant, but somehow he avoided the faces in front of him. "I'm going to tell you about him. This is the man who organized the strike. He found the money and the men to do the dirty work. He did it because he hates me and wants to ruin me. He came to you with plausible tales of oppression and so forth. He cared nothing for you, but he hated me. I tell you frankly he did this thing because he knew I was pushed to the last point to make good my contract with the government, because he knew that to delay the output of logs from this camp meant that I should go to smash. In doing this he meant to carry you down with me. That's how much he cares for your interests." A growl of anger punctuated his speech, but he silenced them with a gesture and proceeded. His voice was getting weaker, and a deadly pallor was stealing over his face. Chepstow, watching him, was filled with anxiety. Betty's brown eyes clung to his face with an expression of love, horror, and pity in them that spoke far louder than any words. Mason was simply calculating in his mind how long Dave could keep up his present attitude. "Do you get my meaning, boys?" he went on. "It's this. If we don't get this work through before winter, I'm broke to my last dollar. And you'll be out of a billet, every mother's son of you, with the winter staring you in the face." He paused and took a deep breath. Betty even thought she saw him sway. The men kept an intense silence. "Well," he went on a moment later, pulling himself together with an evident effort, "I'm just here to talk straight business, and that's what you're going to listen to. First, I'll tell you this fellow's going to get his right medicine through me in the proper manner. Then, second and last, I want to give you a plain understanding of things between ourselves. There's going to be no rise in wages. I just can't do it. That's all. But I'm going to give each man in my camp a big bonus, a nice fat wad of money with which to paint any particular town he favors red, when the work's done. That's to be extra, above his wages. And the whole lot of you shall work for me next season on a guarantee. But from now to the late fall you're going to work, boys. You're going to work as if the devil himself was driving you. We've got time to make up, and shortage besides, and you've got to make it up. I don't want any slackers. Men who have any doubts can get right out. You've got to work as you've never worked in your lives before. Now, boys, give us your word. Is it work, or—" Dave got no further. A shout, hearty, enthusiastic, went up from the crowd. It meant work, and he was satisfied. The next few minutes were passed in a scene of the wildest excitement. The men closed round the buckboard and struggled with each other to grip the big man's hand. And Dave, faint and weary as he was, knew them too well to reject their friendly overtures. Besides, they were, as he said, like himself, men of the woods, and he was full of a great sympathy and friendliness for them. At last, however, he turned to Chepstow. "Drive them back to the dugout, Tom," he said. "Things are getting misty. I think I'm done." End of chapter 29. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 30 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 30. In the Dugout. 3 arduous and anxious days followed the ending of the strike, and each of the occupants of Mason's dugout felt the strain of them in his or her own particular way. Next to the strike itself, Dave's wound was the most serious consideration. He was the leader, the rudder of his ship. His was the controlling brain, and he was a most exasperating patient. His wound was bad enough, though not dangerous. It would be weeks before the use of his left arm was restored to him, but he had a way of forgetting this, of forgetting that he had lost a great quantity of blood, until weakness prostrated him and roused him to a peevish perversity. Betty was his self-appointed nurse. Tom Chepstow might examine his wound and consider his condition, but it was Betty who dressed his wound, Betty who prepared his food and ministered to his lightest needs. From the moment of his return to the dugout she took charge of him. She consulted no one, she asked for no help. For the time, at least, he was her possession. He was hers to lavish all the fullness of her great love upon, a love that had something almost material in its wonderful protective instinct. Mason was busy with the work of reorganization. His was the practical hand and head while Dave was on his sick bed. From daylight to long after dark he took no rest. Dave's counsel guided him to an extent, but much had to be done without any consultation with the master of the mills. Provisioning the camp was a problem not easily solved. It was simple enough to order up food from Malkern, but there would be at least a week's delay before its arrival. Finally he surmounted this difficulty through the return of Lieberstein, who had fled to the woods with his cash-box and a supply of provisions at the first sign of trouble. Now he had returned to save what he could from the wreck. The Jew needed assistance to recover his looted property, what remained of it. The overseer gave him that assistance, and at the same time arranged that all provisions so recovered should be redistributed at a price, as rations to the men. Thus the delay in the arrival of supplies from Malkern was tided over. But though he availed himself of this means by getting over his difficulty, he was fully determined to rid the camp, at the earliest opportunity, of so treacherous a rascal as Lieberstein. In 2 days the work of restoration was in full swing. The burned store and shanties were run up with all a lumberman's rapidity and disregard for finish. Time was the thing that mattered, and so wonderfully did Mason drive and cajole his men that on the 3rd day the gangs once more marched out into the woods. Once again the forests echoed with the hiss of saw, the ringing clang of smiting axe, the crash of falling trees, the harsh voices of the woodsmen, and the 101 sounds of bustling activity which belong to a lumber camp in full work. That day was a pleasant one for the occupants of the dugout. It was a wonderful work Mason had done. They all knew and appreciated his devotion to his wounded employer, and though none spoke of it, whenever he appeared in their midst, their appreciation of him showed in their manner. Betty was very gentle and kindly. She saw that he wanted for nothing in the way of the comforts which the dugout could provide. Tom Chepstow was far too busy with his sick to give attention to anything else. His hands were very full, and his was a task that showed so little result. Dave, for the most part, saw everything that was going on about him, and had a full estimate of all that was being done in his interests by the devoted little band, and, absurdly enough, the effect upon him was to stir him to greater irritability. It was evening, and the slanting sunlight shone in through one of the windows. It was a narrow beam of light, but its effect was sufficiently cheering. No dugout is a haven of brightness, and just now this one needed all that could help to lift the shadow of sickness and disaster that pervaded it. Betty was preparing supper, and Dave, lying on his stretcher, his vast bulk only half concealed by the blanket thrown over him, was watching the girl with eyes that fed hungrily upon the swift, graceful movements of her pretty figure, the play of expression upon her sweet, sun-tanned face, the intentness, the whole-hearted concentration in her steady, serious eyes as she went about her work. Now and again she glanced over at his rough bed, but he seemed to be asleep every time she turned in his direction. The result was an additional care in her work. She made no noise lest she should waken him. Presently she stooped and pushed a log into the firebox of the cook-stove. The cinders fell with a clatter, and she glanced round apprehensively. Her movement was so sudden that Dave's wide-open eyes had no time to shut. In a moment she was all contrition at her clumsiness. "I'm so sorry, Dave," she exclaimed. I did so hope you'd sleep on till supper. It's half an hour yet." "I haven't been sleeping at all." "Why, He smiled and shook his head, and his smile delighted the girl. It was the first she had seen in him since his arrival in the camp. His impatience at being kept to his bed was perhaps dying out. She had always heard that the most active and impatient always became reconciled to bed in the end. "Yes, I did it on purpose," Dave said, still smiling. "You see, I wanted to think. You'd have talked if I hadn't. Oh, Dave!" Betty's reproach had something very like resentment in it. She turned abruptly to the boiler of stew and tasted its contents, while the man chuckled softly. But she turned round on him again almost immediately. "Why are you laughing?" she demanded quickly. But he did not seem inclined to enlighten her. "Half an hour to supper?" he said musingly. "Tom'll be in directly, and Mason." Betty was still looking at him with her cooking spoon poised as it had been when she tasted the stew. "Yes," she said, "they'll be in directly. I've only just got to make the tea." She dropped the spoon upon the table and replaced the lid of the boiler. Then she came over to his bedside. "What did you mean saying I should have talked?" she asked. Only now there was a smiling response to the smile still lurking in the gray depths of the man's eyes. Dave drew a long sigh of resignation. "Well, you see, Betty, if I'd laid here with my eyes open, staring about the room, at you, at the roof, at the window for a whole heap of time, you'd have said to yourself, 'Dave's suffering, sure. He can't sleep. He's miserable, unhappy.' You'd have said all those things, and with all your kind little heart, you'd have set to work to cheer me up, same as you'd no doubt have done for that strike leader fellow you shipped over to the sick camp to make room for me. Well, I just didn't want that kind of cheering. I was thinking mighty hard, figuring how best to make a broken-winged owl fly without waiting for the wing to mend. You see, thinking's mostly all I can do just now, and I need to do such a mighty heap to keep me from getting mad and breaking things. You see, every hour, as I lie here, I kind of seem to be storing up steam, like a locomotive, and sometimes I feel as if I was going to bust. Being sick makes me hate things." His smiling protest was yet perfectly serious. The girl understood. A moment later he went on. "Half an hour to supper?" he said, as though suddenly reaching a decision that had cost him much thought. "Well, just sit right down on this stretcher, and I'm going to talk you tired. I'm sick, so you can't refuse." The man's eyes still smiled, but the seriousness of his manner had increased. Nor was Betty slow to observe it. She gladly seated herself on the edge of the stretcher, and without the least embarrassment, without the least self-consciousness, her soft eyes rested on the rugged face of her patient. She was glad that he wanted to talk, and to her, and she promptly took him up in his own tone. "Well, I've got to listen, I suppose," she said with a bright smile. "As you say, you're sick. You might have added that I am your nurse." "Yes, I suppose you are. It seems funny, me needing a nurse. I suppose I do need one?" Betty nodded. Her eyes were bright with an emotion that the man's words had all unconsciously stirred. This man, so strong for himself, so strong to help others, this man on whom all who came into contact with him leaned as upon some staunch, unfailing support, This man so invincible, so masterful, so eager in the battle where the odds were against him, needed a nurse. A great pity, a great sympathy went out to him. Then a feeling of joy and gratitude at the thought that she was his nurse succeeded it. She alone had the right to wait upon him. But her face expressed none of these feelings when she replied. She nodded gravely. "Yes, you need a nurse, you poor old Dave. Just for once you're going to give others a chance of being to you what you have always been to them. It breaks my heart to see you on a sick bed. But, Dave, you can never know the joy, the happiness it gives me to be your nurse. All my life it has been the other way. All my life you have been my wise counselor, my ever-ready loyal friend. Now, in ever so small a degree, you have to lean on me. Don't be perverse, Dave. Let me help you all I can. Don't begrudge me so small a happiness. But you said you were going to talk me tired, and I'm doing it all." She laughed lightly, but it was a laugh to hide her real feelings. The man's uninjured arm reached out, and his great hand rested heavily on one of hers. The pressure of his fingers, intended to be gentle, was crushing. His action meant so much. No words could have thanked her more truly than that hand pressure. Betty's face grew warm with delight, and she turned her eyes toward the stove, as though to see that all was well with her cooking. "They're cutting to-day?" Dave's eyes were turned upon the window. The sunlight was dying out now, and the gray dusk was stealing upon the room. Betty understood the longing in the man's heart. "Yes, they're cutting." He stirred uneasily. "My shoulder is mending fast," he said a moment later, and the girl saw his drift. She shook her head. "It's mending, but it won't be well for weeks," she said. "It's got to be," he said with tense emphasis, after a long pause. His voice was low, but thrilling with the purpose of a mind that would not bend to the weakness of his body. "You must be patient, Dave, dear," the girl said, with the persuasiveness of a mother for her child. For a moment the man's brows drew together in a frown, and his lips compressed. "Betty, Betty, I can't be patient," he suddenly burst out. "I know I'm all wrong, but I can't be patient. You know what all this means. I'm not going to attempt to tell you. You understand it all. I cannot lie here a day longer. Even now I seem to hear the saws and axes at work. I seem to see the men moving through the forests. I seem to hear Mason's orders in the dead calm of the woods. With the first logs that are travoyed to the river, I must leave here and get back to Malkern. There is work to be done, and from now on it will be man's work. It will be more than a fight against time. It will be a battle against almost incalculable odds, a battle in which all is against us. Betty, you are my nurse, and as you hope to see me through with this broken shoulder, so you must not attempt to alter my decision. I know you. You want to see me fit and well. Before all things you desire that. You will understand me when I say that before all things I must see the work through. My bodily comfort must not be considered, and as my friend, as my nurse, you must not hinder me. I must leave here tonight." The man had lifted himself to a half-sitting posture in his excitement, and the girl watched him with anxious eyes. Now she reached out, and one hand gently pressed him back to his pillow. As he had said, she understood, and when she spoke Her words were the words he wished to hear. They soothed him at once. "Yes, Dave, if you must return, it shall be as you say." He caught her hand and held it, crushing its small round flesh in the hollow of his great palm. It was his gratitude for her understanding and sympathy. His eyes met hers. And in that moment something else stirred in him. The pressure tightened upon her unresisting hand. The blood mounted to her head. It seemed to intoxicate her. It was a moment of such ecstasy as she had dreamed of in a vague sort of way. A moment when the pure woman spirit in her was exalted to such a throne of spiritual light as is beyond the dream of human imagination. In the man, too, was a change. There was something looking out of his eyes which seemed to have banished his last thought of that lifelong desire for the success of his labors, something which left him no room for anything else, something which had for its inception all the human passionate desire of his tremendous soul. His gray eyes glowed with a living fire. They deepened. A flush of hot blood surged over his rugged features, lighting them out of their plainness. His temples throbbed visibly, and the vast sinews shivered with the fire that swept through his body. In a daze Betty understood the change. Her heart leaped out to him, yielding all her love, all that was hers to give. It cried aloud her joy in the passion of those moments, but her lips were silent. She had gazed into heaven for one brief instant, then her eyes dropped before a vision she dared no longer to look upon. "Betty!" The man had lifted to his elbow again. A torrent of passionate words rushed to his lips, but they remained unspoken. His heavy tongue was incapable of giving them expression. He halted. That one feverish exclamation was all that came, for his tongue clave in his mouth. But in that one word was the avowal of such a love as rarely falls to the lot of woman. It was the man's whole being that spoke. Betty's hand twisted from his grasp. She sprang to her feet and turned to the door. "It's Bob Mason," she said, in a voice that was almost an awed whisper, as she rushed to the cook stove. The camp boss strode heavily into the room. There was a light in his eyes that usually would have gladdened the master of the mills. Now, however, Dave's thoughts were far from the matters of the camp. "We've travoyed 100 to the river bank," the lumberman exclaimed in a tone of triumph. "The work's begun." It was Betty who answered him. Hers was the ready sympathy, the heart to understand for others equally with herself. She turned with a smile of welcome, of pride in his pride. "Bob, you're a gem," she cried, holding out a hand of kindliness to him. And Dave's tardy words followed immediately with characteristic sincerity. "Thanks, Bob," he said in his deep tones. "It's all right, boss. They're working by flare to-night, and they're going on till 10 o'clock." Dave nodded. His thoughts had once more turned into the smooth channel of his affairs. Betty was serving out supper. A few moments later, weary and depressed, the parson came in for his supper. His report was much the same as usual. Progress, all his patients were progressing, but it was slow work, for the recent battle had added to the number of his patients. There was very little talk until supper was over. Then it began as Mason was preparing to depart again to his work. Dave spoke of his decision without any preamble. "Say, folks, I'm going back to Malkern to-night," he said, with a smiling glance of humor at his friends in anticipation of the storm of protest he knew his announcement would bring upon himself. Mason was on his feet in an instant. "You can't do it, boss," he exclaimed. "You—" "No you don't, Dave, old friend," broke in Chepstow, with a shake of his head. "You'll stay right here till I say go." Dave's smile broadened, and his eyes sought Betty's. "Well, Betty?" he demanded. But Betty understood. "I have nothing to say," she replied quietly. Dave promptly turned again to the parson. His smile had gone again. "I've got to go, Tom," he said. "My work's done here, but it hasn't begun yet in Malkern. Do you get my meaning? Until the cutting began up here I was not needed down there. Now it is different. There is no one in Malkern to head things. Dawson and Odd are good men, but they are only my foremen. It is imperative that I go, and tonight." "But look here, boss, it can't be done," cried Mason, with a sort of hopeless earnestness. "You aren't fit to move yet. The journey down, you'd never stand it. Besides—" "Yes, besides, who's going to take you down? How are you going?" Chepstow broke in sharply. He meant to clinch the matter once for all. Dave's manner returned to the peevishness of his invalid state. "There's the buckboard," he said sharply. "Can you drive it?" demanded the parson with equal sharpness. "I can't take you down. I can't leave the sick. Mason is needed here. Well?" "Don't worry, I'm driving myself," Dave said soberly. Chepstow sprang to his feet and waved his pipe in the air in his angry impatience. "You're mad. You drive? Hang it, man, you couldn't drive a team of fleas. Get up. Get up from that stretcher now and see how much driving you could do. See here, Dave, I absolutely forbid you to attempt any such thing." Dave raised himself upon his elbow. His steady eyes had something of an angry smile in them. "See here, Tom," he said, imitating the other's manner. "You can talk till you're black in the face. I'm going down tonight. Mason's going to hook the buckboard up for me and fetch Truscott along. I'll have to take him down, too. It's no use in your kicking, Tom," he went on, as the parson opened his lips for further protest. "I'm going." He turned again to Mason. "I'll need the buckboard and team in an hour. Guess you'll see to it, boy. And say, just set the food for the two of us in it, and half a sack of oats for the horses." "One moment, Bob," interrupted Betty. She had been merely an interested listener to the discussion, sitting at the far end of the supper table. Now she came over to Dave's bedside. "You'd best put in food for 3. Then she looked down at Dave, smiling reassurance. From him she turned to her uncle with a laughing glance. "Trust you men to argue and wrangle over things that can be settled without the least difficulty. Dave here must get down to Malkern. I understand the importance of his presence there. Very well, he must go. Therefore it's only a question of how he can get there with the least possible danger to himself. It's plain Bob can't go down. He must see the work through here. You, uncle, must also stay. It is your duty to the sick. We cannot send any of the men. They are all needed. Well, I'm going to drive him down. We'll make him comfortable in the carryall, and Truscott can share the driving seat with me, carefully secured to prevent him getting away. There you are. I will be responsible for Dave's welfare. You need not be anxious." She turned with such a look of confident affection upon the sick man that, for the moment, no one had a word of protest to offer. It was Dave who spoke first. He took her hand in his and nodded his great head at her. "Thanks, little Betty," he said. "I shall be perfectly safe in your charge." And his words were ample reward to the woman who loved him. It was his acknowledgment of his dependence upon her. After that there was discussion, argument, protest for nearly half an hour. But Dave and Betty held to their decision, and at last Tom Chepstow gave way to them. Then it was that Mason went off to make preparations. The parson went to assist him, and Betty and Dave were once more alone. Betty let her uncle go, and then lit the lamp. For some moments no word was spoken between the sick man and his nurse. The girl cleared the supper things and put a kettle on the stove. Then, while watching for it to boil, she was about to pack up her few belongings for the journey. But she changed her mind. Instead, she came back to the table and faced the stretcher on which the sick man was lying. "Dave," she said in a low voice, "will you promise me something?" Dave turned his face toward her. "Anything," he said, in all seriousness. The girl waited. She was gauging the meaning of his reply. In anybody else that answer could not have been taken seriously. In him it might be different. "It's a big thing," she said doubtfully. "It don't matter, little girl. I just mean it." She came slowly over to his side. "Do you remember I once got you to teach me the business of the mill? I wanted to learn then so I could help someone. I want to help someone now. But it's a different someone this time. Do you understand? I haven't forgotten a single thing I learned from you. Will you let me help you? You cannot do all now. Not until your arm is better." She dropped upon her knees at his bedside. "Dave, don't refuse me. You shall just give your orders to me. I will see they are carried out. We, you and I together, will run your mills to the success that I know is going to be yours. Don't say no, Dave, dear." The man had turned to her. He was looking into the depths of the fearless brown eyes before him. He had no intention of refusing her, but he was looking deep down into the beautiful woman's heart that was beating within her bosom. "I'll not refuse you, Betty. I only thank God Almighty for such a little friend." End of chapter 30. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 31 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, a story of the Red Sand Valley by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 31. At Midnight. The silence of the night was unbroken. The valley of the Red Sand River was wrapped in a peace such as it had never known since Dave had first brought into it the restless activity of his American spirit. But it was a depressing peace to the dwellers in the valley, for it portended disaster. No word had reached them of the prospects at the mill, only a vague rumor had spread of the doings at the lumber camp. Dave knew the value of silence in such matters, and he had taken care to enforce silence on all who were in a position to enlighten the minds which thirsted for such information. The people of Malkern were waiting waiting for something definite on the part of the master of the mills. On him depended their future movements. The mill was silent, even though the work of repairing had been completed. But as yet they had not lost faith in the man who had piloted them through all the shoals of early struggles to the haven of comparative prosperity. However, the calm, the unwonted silence of the valley depressed and worried them. They longed for the drone, however monotonous, of the mill. They loved it, for it meant that the wheels of life were well oiled, and that they were driving pleasantly along their set track to the terminal of success. Yet while the village slept, all was intense activity at the mills. The men had been gathered together again, late that night, and the army of workers was once more complete. The sawyers were at their saws, oiling and fitting, and generally making ready for work. The engineers were at their engines, the firemen at their furnaces. The lumberjacks were at the chutes and in the yards. The boom was manned by men who sat around smoking, peavey in hand, ready to handle the mightiest 90-footers that the mountain forests could send them. The checkers were at their posts, and the tally boys were shooting craps at the foot of the chutes. The mill, like a resting giant lying prone upon his back, was bursting with the latent strength and activity that only needed the controlling will to set in motion, to drive it to an effort such as Malkern had never seen before, such as, perhaps, Malkern would never see again. And inside Dave's office that will lay watching and waiting. It was a curious scene inside the office. The place had been largely converted since the master of the mills had returned. It was half sick-room, half office, and the feminine touch about the place was quite incongruous in the office of such a man as Dave. But then just now Dave's control was only of the mill outside. In this room he yielded to another authority. He was in the hands of women-folk, that is, his body was. He had no word to say in the arrangement of the room, and he was only permitted to think his control outside. It was 11 o'clock, and his mother was preparing to take her departure. Since his return from the camp, she was her son's almost constant attendant. Betty's chief concern was for the mill outside, and the careful execution of the man's orders to his foreman. She took a share of the nursing, but only in moments of leisure, and these were very few. Now she had just returned from a final inspection and consultation with Dawson, and the glow of satisfaction on her face was good to see. "Now, Mother dear," she said, after having made her report to Dave, "you've got to be off home and to bed. You've had a long, hard day, and I'm going to relieve you. Dave is all right, and," she added with a smile, "maybe he'll be better still before morning. We expect the logs down by daylight, and then I guess their arrival in the boom will do more to mend his poor broken shoulder than all our quacks and nostrums. So be off with you. I shall be here all night. I don't intend to rest till the first log enters the boom." The old woman rose wearily from her rocking chair at her boy's bedside. Her worn face was tired. At her age the strain of nursing was very heavy. But whatever weakness there was in her body, her spirit was as strong as the younger woman's. Her boy was sick, and nothing else could compare with a disaster of that nature. But now she was ready to go, for so it had been arranged between them earlier. She crossed to Betty's side, and placing her hands upon the girl's shoulders, kissed her tenderly on both cheeks. "God bless and keep you, dearie," she said with deep emotion. "I'd like to tell you all I feel, but I can't. You're our guardian angel, Dave's and mine. Good night." "Good night, Mother dear," said the girl, her eyes brightening with a suspicion of tears. Then, with an assumption of lightness which helped to disguise her real feelings, "Now don't you stay awake. Go right off to sleep, and in the morning you shall hear the mills." The old woman nodded and smiled. Next to her boy, she loved this motherless girl best in the world. She gathered up her few belongings and went to the bedside. Bending over the sick man, she kissed his rugged face tenderly. For a moment one great arm held her in its tremendous embrace, then she toddled out of the room. Betty took her rocking chair. She sat back and rocked herself in silence for some moments. Her eyes wandered over the curious little room, noting the details of it as though hugging to herself the memory of the smallest trifle that concerned this wonderful time that was hers. There was Dave's desk before the window. It was hers now. There were the vast tomes that recorded his output of lumber. She had spent hours over them calculating figures for the man beside her. There were the flowers his mother had brought, and which she had found time to arrange so that he could see and enjoy them. There were the bandages it was her duty to adjust. There were the remains of the food of which they had both partaken. It was all real, yet so strange to her who had spent her life surrounded by all those duties so essentially feminine, so closely allied to her uncle's spiritual calling. She felt that she had moved out into a new world, a world in which there was room for her to expand, in which she could bring into play all those faculties which she had always known herself to possess, but which had so long lain dormant that she had almost come to regard her belief in their existence as a mere dream, a mere vanity. It was a wonderful thing, this, that had happened to her, and the happiness of it was so overwhelming that it almost made her afraid. Yet the fact remained. She was working for him. She was working with her muscles and brain extended. She sighed, and, placing her hands behind her head, stretched luxuriously. It was good to feel the muscles straining. It was good to contemplate the progress of things in his interests. It was good to love, and to feel that that love was something more practical than the mere sentimentality of awakened passion. Her wandering attention was recalled by a movement of her patient. She glanced round at him, and his face was turned toward her. Her smiling eyes responded to his steady, contemplative gaze. "Well?" he said, in a grave, subdued voice. "It ought to be getting near now?" The girl nodded. "I don't see how we can tell exactly, but, unless anything goes wrong, the first log should get through before daylight. It's good to think of, Dave." Her eyes sparkled with delight at the prospect. The man eyed her for a few silent moments, and his eyes deepened to a passionate warmth. "You're a great little woman, Betty," he said at last. "When I think of all you have done for me, well, I just feel that my life can never be long enough to repay you in. Throughout this business you have been my second self, with all the freshness and enthusiasm of a mind and heart thrilling with youthful strength. I can never forget the journey down from the camp. When I think of the awful physical strain you must have gone through, driving day and night, with a prisoner beside you, and a useless hulk of a man lying behind, I marvel. When I think that you had to do everything, feed us, camp for us, see to the horses for us, it all seems like some fantastic dream. How did you do it? How did I come to let you? It makes me smile to think that I, in my manly superiority, simply lolled about with a revolver handy to enforce our prisoner's obedience to your orders. Ah, little Betty, I can only thank Almighty God that I have been blessed with such a little friend." The girl laid the tips of her fingers over his mouth. "You mustn't say these things," she said in a thrilling voice. "We, you and I, are just here together to work out your plans. God has been very, very good to me that He has given me the power, in however small a degree, to help you. Now let us put these things from our minds for a time and be practical. Talking of our prisoner, what are you going to do with poor Jim?" It was some moments before David answered her. It was not that he had no answer to her question, but her words had sent his mind wandering off among long past days. He was thinking of the young lad he had so ardently tried to befriend. He was thinking of the poor Jim of then and now. He was recalling that day when those two had come to him with their secret, with their youthful hope of the future, and of all that day had meant to him. They had planned, he had planned, and now it was all so different. His inclination was to show this man leniency, but his inclination had no power to alter his resolve. When he spoke there was no resentment in his tone against the man who had so cruelly tried to ruin him, only a quiet decision. "I want you to tell Simon Odd to bring him here," he said. Then he smiled. "I intend him to spend the night with me, that is, until the first log comes down the river." "What are you going to do?" The man's smile increased in tenderness. "Don't worry your little head about that, Betty," he said. "There are things which must be said between us, things which only men can say to men. I promise you he will be free to go when the mill starts work, but not until then." His eyes grew stern. "I owe you so much, Betty," he went on, "that I must be frank with you. So much depends upon our starting work again that I cannot let him go until that happens." "And if, just supposing, that does not happen? I mean, supposing, through his agency, the mill remains idle?" "I cannot answer you. I have only one thing to add." Dave had raised himself upon his elbow, and his face was hard and set. "No man may bring ruin upon a community to satisfy his own mean desires, his revenge, however that revenge may be justified. If we fail, if Malkern is to be made to suffer through that man, God help him." The girl was facing him now. Her two hands were outstretched appealingly. "But, Dave, should you judge him? Have you the right? Surely there is but one judge, and his alone is the right to condemn weak, erring human nature. Surely it is not for you, us—" Dave dropped back upon his pillow. There was no relenting in his eyes. "His own work shall judge him," he said in a hard voice. "What I may do is between him and me." Betty looked at him long and earnestly. Then she rose from her chair. "So be it, Dave. I ask you but one thing. Deal with him as your heart prompts you, not as your head dictates. I will send him to you, and will come back again, when the mill is at work." Their eyes met in one long, ardent gaze. The man nodded, and the smile in his eyes was very, very tender. "Yes, Betty. Don't leave me too long. I can't do without you now." The girl's eyes dropped before the light she beheld in his. "I don't want you to do without me," she murmured, and she hurried out of the room. End of chapter 31. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 32 of The Trail of the Axe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Trail of the Axe, A Story of the Red Sand Valley, by Ridgwell Cullum. Chapter 32. 2 Men and a Woman. It took some time for Betty to carry out Dave's wishes. Simon Odd, who was Jim Truscott's jailer while the mills were idle, and who had him secreted away where curious eyes were not likely to discover him, was closely occupied with the preparations at the other mill. She had to dispatch a messenger to him, and the messenger having found Simon, it was necessary for the latter to procure his prisoner and hand him over to Dave himself. All this took a long time, nearly an hour and a half, which made it 2 o'clock in the morning before Truscott reached the office under his escort. Odd presented him with scant ceremony. He knocked on the door, was admitted, and stood close behind his charge's shoulder. "Here he is, boss," said the man with rough freedom. "Will I stand by in case he gets gay?" But Dave had his own ideas. He needed no help from anybody in dealing with this man. "No," he said at once. "You can get back to your mill. I relieve you of all further responsibility of your charge. But you can pass me some things to prop my pillow up before you go." The giant foreman did as he was bid. Being just a plain lumberman, with no great nicety of fancy, he selected 3 of the ledgers for the purpose. Having propped his employer into a sitting posture, he took his departure in silence. Dave waited until the door closed behind him. His cold eyes were on the man who had so nearly ruined him, who, indirectly, had nearly cost him his life. As the door closed, he drew his right hand from under the blankets, and in it was a revolver. He laid the weapon on the blanket, and his fingers rested on the butt. Jim Truscott watched his movements, but his gaze was more mechanical than one of active interest. What his thoughts were at the moment it would have been hard to say, except that they were neither easy nor pleasant, if one judged from the lowering expression of his weak face. The active hatred which he had recently displayed in Dave's presence seemed to be lacking now. It almost seemed as though the rough handling he had been treated to, the failure of his schemes for Dave's ruin, had dulled the edge of his vicious antagonism. It was as though he were indifferent to the object of the meeting, to its outcome. He did not even seem to appreciate the significance of the presence of that gun under Dave's fingers. His attitude was that of a man beaten in the fight where all the odds had seemed in his favor. His mind was gazing back upon the scene of his disaster as though trying to discover the joint in the armor of his attack which had rendered him vulnerable and brought about his defeat. Dave understood something of this. His understanding was more the result of his knowledge of a character he had studied long ago, before the vicious life the man had since lived had clouded the ingenuous impulses of a naturally weak but happy nature. He did not fathom the man's thoughts. He did not even guess at them. He only knew the character, and the rest was like reading from an open book. In his heart he was more sorry for him than he would have dared to admit, but his mind was thinking of all the suffering the mischief of this one man had caused, might yet cause. Betty had displayed a wonderful wisdom when she bade him let his heart govern his judgment in dealing with this man. "You'd best sit down, Jim," Dave said. Already his heart was defying his head. That use of a familiar first name betrayed him. "It may be a long sitting. You're going to stay right here with me until the mill starts up work. I don't know how long that'll be." Truscott made no answer. He showed he had heard and understood by glancing round for a chair. In this quest his eyes rested for a moment on the closed door. They passed on to the chair at the desk. Then they returned to the door again. Dave saw the glance and spoke sharply. "You'd best sit, boy. That door is closed to you. And I'm here to keep it closed to you." Still the man made no reply. He turned slowly toward the chair at the desk and sat down. His whole attitude expressed weariness. It was the dejected weariness of a brain overcome by hopelessness. Watching him, Dave's mind reverted to Betty in association with him. He wondered at the nature of this man's regard for her, a regard which was his excuse for the villainies he had planned and carried out against him and the mills. His thoughts went back to the day of their boy and girl engagement, as he called it now. He remembered the eager, impulsive lover, weak, selfish, but full of passion and youthful protestations. He thought of his decision to go away, and the manner of it. He remembered it was Betty who finally decided for them both. And her decision was against his more selfish desires, but one that opened out for him the opportunity of showing himself to be the man she thought him. Yes, this man had been too young, too weak, too self-indulgent. There lay the trouble of his life. His love for Betty, if it could be called by so pure a name, had been a mere self-indulgence, a passionate desire of the moment that swept every other consideration out of its path. There was not that underlying strength needed for its support. Was he wholly to blame? Dave thought not. Then there was that going to the Yukon. He had protested at the boy's decision. He had known from the first that his character had not the strength to face the pitiless breath of that land of snowy desolation. How could one so weak pit himself against the cruel forces of nature, such as are to be found in that land? It was impossible. The inevitable had resulted. He had fallen to the temptations of the easier paths of vice in Dawson, and, lost in that whirl, Betty was forgotten. His passion died down, satiated in the filthy dives of Dawson. Then had come his return to Malkern. Stinking with the contamination of his vices, he had returned caring for nothing but himself. He had once more encountered Betty. The pure, fresh beauty of the girl had promptly set his vitiated soul on fire. But now there was no love, not even a love such as had been his before, but only a mad desire, a desire as uncontrolled as the wind-swept rollers of a raging sea. It was the culminating evil of a manhood debased by a long period of loose, vicious living. She must be his at any cost, and opposition only fired his desire the more, and drove him to any length to attain his end. The pity of it! A spirit, a bright, buoyant spirit, lost in the mad whirl of a nature it had not been given him the power to control. His heart was full of a sorrowful regret. His heart bled for the man, while his mind condemned his ruthless actions. He lay watching in a silence that made the room seem heavy and oppressive. As yet he had no words for the man who had come so nearly to ruining him. He had not brought him there to preach to him, to blame him, to twit him with the failure of his evil plans, the failure he had made of a life that had promised so much. He held him there that he might settle his reckoning with him, once and for all, in a manner which should shut him out of his life forever. He intended to perform an action the contemplation of which increased the sorrow he felt 100-fold, but one which he was fully determined upon as being the only course, in justice to Betty, to Malkern, to himself, possible. The moments ticked heavily away. Truscott made no move. He gave not the slightest sign of desiring to speak. His eyes scarcely heeded his surroundings. It was almost as if he had no care for what this man who held him in his power intended to do. It almost seemed as though the weight of his failure had crushed the spirit within him, as though a dreary lassitude had settled itself upon him, and he had no longer a thought for the future. Once during that long silence he lifted his large bloodshot eyes, and his gaze encountered the other's steady regard. They dropped almost at once, but in that fleeting glance Dave read the smoldering fire of hate which still burned deep down in his heart. The sight of it had no effect. The man's face alone interested him. It looked years older, it bore a tracery of lines about the eyes and mouth, which, at his age, it had no right to possess. His hair, too, was already graying amongst the curls that had always been one of his chief physical attractions. It was thinning, too, a premature thinning at the temples, which also had nothing to do with his age. Later, again, the man's eyes turned upon the door with a calculating gaze. They came back to the bed where Dave was lying. The movement was unmistakable. Dave's fingers tightened on the butt of his revolver, and his great head was moved in a negative shake, and the ominous shining muzzle of his revolver said plainly, "Don't." Truscott seemed to understand, for he made no movement, nor did he again glance at the door. It was a strange scene. It was almost appalling in its significant silence. What feelings were passing, what thoughts, no one could tell from the faces of the two men. That each was living through a small world of recollection, mostly bitter, perhaps regretful, there could be no doubt, yet neither gave any sign. They were both waiting. In the mind of one it was a waiting for what he could not even guess at. In the other it was for something for which he longed yet feared might not come. The hands of the clock moved on, but neither heeded them. Time meant nothing to them now. An hour passed, an hour and a half, 2 hours of dreadful silence. That vigil seemed endless, and its silence appalling. Then suddenly a sound reached the waiting ears. It was a fierce hissing, like an escape of steam. It grew louder, and into the hiss came a hoarse tone, like a harsh voice trying to bellow through the rushing steam. It grew louder and louder. The voice rose to a long-drawn hoot, which must have been heard far down the wide spread of the Red Sand Valley. It struck deep into Dave's heart, and loosed in it such a joy as rarely comes to the heart of man. It was the steam siren of the mill belching out its message to a sleeping village. The master of the mills had triumphed over every obstacle. The mill had once more started work. Dave waited until the last echo of that welcome voice had died out. Then, as his ears drank in the welcome song of his saws, plunging their jagged fangs into the newly arrived logs, he was content. He turned to the man in the chair. "Did you hear that, Jim? Do you know what it means?" he asked, in a voice softened by the emotion of the moment. Truscott's eyes lifted, but he made no answer. The light in them was ugly. He knew. "It means that you are free to go," Dave went on. "It means that my contract will be successfully completed within the time limit. It means that you will leave this village at once and never return, or the penitentiary awaits you for the wrecking of my mills." Truscott rose from his seat. The hate in his heart was stirring. It was rising to his head. The fury of his eyes was appalling. Dave saw it. He shifted his gun and gripped it tightly. "Wait a bit, lad," he said coldly. "It means more than all that to you. A good deal more. Can you guess it? It means that I, and not you, am going to marry Betty Somers." God! The man was hit as Dave had meant him to be hit. He started, and his clenched hands went up as though about to strike. The devil in his eyes was appalling. "Now go! Quick!" The word leaped from the lumberman's lips, and his gun went up threateningly. For a moment it seemed as though Truscott was about to spring upon him, regardless of the weapon's shining muzzle. But he did not move. A gun in Dave's hand was no idle threat, and he knew it. Besides, he had not the moral strength of the other. He moved to the door and opened it. Then, for one fleeting second, he looked back. It may have been to reassure himself that the gun was still there. It may have been a last expression of his hate. Another moment, and he was gone. Dave replaced his gun beneath the blankets and sighed. Betty sprang into the room. "Hello, door open?" she demanded, glancing about her suspiciously. Then her sparkling eyes came back to the injured man. "Do you hear, Dave?" she cried, in an ecstasy of excitement. "Did you hear the siren? I pulled and held the valve cord. Did you hear it? Thank God!" Dave's happy smile was sufficient for the girl. Had he heard it? His heart was still ringing with its echoes. "Betty, come here," he commanded. "Help me up." "Why—" "Help me up, dear," the man begged. "I must get up. I must get to the door. Don't you understand, child? I must see." "But you can't go out, Dave." "I know. Only to the door. But I must see." The girl came over to his bedside. She lifted him with a great effort. He sat up. Then he swung his feet off the bed. "Now, little girl, help me." It felt good to him to reinforce his will upon Betty in this way. And the girl obeyed him with all her strength, with all her heart stirred at his evident weakness. He stood leaning on her shakily. "Now, little Betty," he said, breathing heavily, "take me to the door." He placed his sound arm around her shoulders. He even leaned more heavily upon her than was necessary. It was good to lean on her. He liked to feel her soft, round shoulders under his arm. Then, too, he could look down upon the masses of warm brown hair which crowned her head. To him his weakness was nothing in the joy of that moment, in the joy of his contact with her. They moved slowly toward the door. He made the pace slower than necessary. To him they were delicious moments. To Betty, she did not know what she felt as her arm encircled his great waist, and all her woman's strength and love was extended to him. At the door they paused. They stared out into the yards. The great mills loomed up in the ruddy flare light. It was a dark, shadowy scene in that inadequate light. The steady shriek of the saws filled the air. The grinding of machinery droned forth, broken by the pulsing throb of great shafts and moving beams. Men were hurrying to and fro, dim figures full of life and intent upon the labor so long suspended. They could see the trimmed logs sliding down the chutes. They could hear the grind of the rollers. They could hear the shoutings of "checkers," and beyond they could see the glowing reflection of the waste fire. It was a sight that thrilled them both. It was a sight that filled their hearts with thanks to God. Each knew that it meant success. Dave turned from the sight, and his eyes looked down upon the slight figure at his side. Betty looked up into his face. Her eyes were misty with tears of joy. Suddenly she dropped her eyes and looked again at the scene before them. Her heart was beating wildly. Her arm supporting the man at her side was shaking, nor was it with weariness of her task. She felt that it could never tire of that. Dave's deep voice, so gentle, yet so full of the depth and strength of his nature, was speaking. "It's good, Betty. It's good. We've won out, you and I." Her lips moved to protest at the part she had played, but he silenced her. "Yes, you and I," he said softly. "It's all ours, yours and mine. You'll share it with me?" The girl's supporting arm moved convulsively. "No, no," he went on quickly. "Don't take your arm away. I need its support. Betty, little Betty, I need more than that. I need your support always. Say, dear, you'll give it to me. You won't leave me alone now? Betty, Betty, I love you so almighty badly." The girl moved her head as though to avoid his kisses upon her hair. Somehow her face was lifted in doing so, and they fell at once upon her lips instead. End of chapter 32. Recording by Roger Moline. End of The Trail of the Axe by Ridgwell Cullum.